I am delighted to welcome you to this wonderful institution, and I cannot think of a partner organization that I would rather be hosting than the Bipartisan Policy Center. The missions of the National Constitution Center and the Bipartisan Policy Center are uniquely well aligned. You are sitting, ladies and gentlemen, in the world's only institution that is legally required by an act of Congress to, quote, disseminate information about the United States Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And that goal is to increase the awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. That comes from the Constitutional Heritage Act of 1988, which established the National Constitution Center. And that came at a time of hope for bipartisanship when there was commitment on both sides of the aisle to the belief that constitutional conversations could be conducted in nonpartisan terms. And that's exactly what we aim to do here at the NCC. The National Constitution Center has three missions. We are the Museum of We the People, we are America's Town Hall, and we are a national and international center for civic education. As the Museum of We the People, we are thrilled, starting next year, to be displaying one of the 12 original surviving copies of the Bill of Rights. And that's going to be the basis for 3 years of education and debate in connection with the 225th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. As America's Town Hall, we are making tangible the vision of nonpartisan constitutional conversation that our founders had in mind. Starting at the end of June, during the last Supreme Court term, I was so excited to host here at the center and on the web conversations between scholars on the left and the right debating Supreme Court decisions as they came down. And starting in the fall, we're going to be conducting these town hall conversations in every media form, on the web and on radio and on television. And citizens from around the country are going to be able to come to the National Constitution Center, hear all sides of current constitutional debates, and make up their own minds. And finally, as a center for civic education, we are committed to bringing the Constitution into schools and having conversations among public school teachers and judges and legislators with the best interactive Constitution in the world on the web that will give citizens access to the deepest and best historical material and once again allow them to engage contemporary questions. So that's why I'm thrilled that the Bipartisan Policy Center is here and so excited to host this conversation. I'd like to recognize now our founding father, Governor Ed Rendell. He is the former Pennsylvania governor, mayor of Philadelphia, the vice chairman of our board. He worked tirelessly to bring this Museum of We the People to fruition, and we are so proud and grateful for his involvement. Thank you, Governor Rendell. There are so many other distinguished leaders and thinkers from both sides of the aisle in this room that I will not attempt to recognize them individually, but we are tremendously honored to have all of you under one roof. I'm also very excited by the technological component of today's conversation. Citizens around the nation will be joining today's conversation via social media. There are going to be Twitter comments before, during, and after our conversation, and I think this is a model for an experiment of the kind of interactive conversation that will truly make us the town hall of the 21st century. You are here to discuss bipartisanship. This is going to be a rich and challenging series of conversations. As head of the NCC, I'm especially interested in some of the proposals for reform that have a constitutional dimension. I was honored to have a brief conversation with Senator Snowe before the panel, and I'm so impressed by the constitutional reforms that she is championing when she goes around the country arguing for bipartisan commissions for redistricting and for open primaries, and talks about the filibuster. All of those are structural aspects of American democracy with huge constitutional implications for our ability as a society to have debates where citizens of all sides can actually come to consensus. And I'm really looking forward to being a partner with her and with the BBC for these constitutional reforms. Broadly, I hope the National Constitution Center will be a place where you continue to turn to be inspired by the Constitution and its legacy of public service, which is a legacy that all of you embody. And speaking of service, I'd now like to share a few words from our mayor, the mayor of the great city of Philadelphia, Michael Nutter. Thank you so much for being here, and take it away, Mayor Nutter.
Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center's National Conversation on Public Service, and welcome to the City of Philadelphia. The City of Brotherly Love and Sisterly Affection is a fitting venue for this vital dialogue. I regret that I'm unable to join you today, but I know that my good friend Governor Ed Rendell will well represent the Keystone State. As the birthplace of American democracy, Philadelphia enjoys a strong tradition of public service and engagement. The challenges facing our nation require that we channel the spirit of leaders like Ben Franklin and approach policy questions with an energetic, innovative, and cooperative attitude. I believe that public service, in any capacity, is a noble calling. In the years ahead, I hope to see governments, businesses, and nonprofit organizations contribute even more of their respective time and insights toward our common goal. The work of strengthening our democracy never ends. The men and women gathered here today are exceptionally capable of forging a national consensus. Thank you for your work and dedication. Best wishes for a successful conference today.
Good afternoon. I'm former Senator Olympia Snowe and a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I want to welcome you in what is the second series of National Conversations on American Unity. What a true pleasure it is to be able to gather here in the great city of Philadelphia. Not only the birth of America occurred here, but the genesis of what became an unprecedented experiment in governance that forever changed the face of our planet and humankind. Just to think about it, that the two most seminal political documents created were just across the Independence Mall from here. Now just think about the fact that if we could bottle that atmosphere in that room and ship it off to Congress, we would be on to something, right? I want to thank Jeffrey Rosen, obviously, for his visionary and exceptional leadership, both for his and the National Constitution Center for their hosting this important dialogue today. Let us allow the awesome surroundings and the spirit of the Founding Fathers to serve as an inspiration as we convene to explore Americans' attitudes towards public and government service, as well what we can do to ensure that more Americans are actively engaged in their democracy, their communities, and their government. I would like to express my profound appreciation to the USA today, and most especially the Washington Bureau Chief, Susan Page, who's going to be moderating this town meeting conversation as she did at the Reagan Library. But she and USA Today have been invaluable partners with the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Commission on Political Reform in organizing these crucial public forums. I'm also very proud to be able to co-chair the Commission on Political Reform with two former Senate Majority Leaders, Trent Lott, who will be here today, and Tom Daschle, as well as a former Congressman and Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman, whom you'll be hearing from shortly, and former Governor, Senator, and former Secretary of Interior, Dirk Kempthorne, who will be in a subsequent panel. But clearly, this has been a truly important initiative as we move forward in engaging the American people. I am also grateful to all of the commissioners and distinguished guests who represent a wide-ranging array of perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences in both the public and private sector. I'm also delighted to be able to welcome Pennsylvania's own former United States Senator, Senator Harris Wofford. We're delighted to have you here, Senator Wofford. I certainly can tell you that he represented the essence of public service. So we're just delighted that you could be here with us today. The Bipartisan Policy Center created the Commission on Political Reform. And what makes it unique is that we're engaging all of you, the public, in this discussion about the causes and the consequences of America's political partisan divide and what we can do about it, because that's what we are, a can-do organization, because we're a can-do people and we're a can-do country. And we will be issuing a specific set of reforms, both in electoral, congressional, and political, as well as today's emphasis on encouraging public service and what we can do about it. But we will be issuing a set of recommendations at the conclusion of all of these national town meetings. We kicked off the first town meeting, as I said earlier, at the Reagan Library in March. Following today's event, there will be 2 other events. One will occur in October in Columbus, Ohio, at The Ohio State University, and then March in 2014 at the Edward Kennedy Institute and the JFK Library in Boston. And today, you will be hearing from the panelists and exploring ways in which we can encourage more involvement in public service in various aspects to public service. There are many dimensions, obviously, to public service, but most especially is to encourage and broaden and widen the pool of quality individuals who are willing, yes, to run for office or to work in government, but most especially to apply their talents at all levels of government. We have seen the luster of public service, which, has been derived from the promise that it will produce results and solutions. Well, that has been dulled over the years, which is probably an understatement, because of the explosive rise in hyperpartisanship in Washington, as we've seen, in the overall political environment in our political system. Unfortunately, as a consequence, too many successful, talented people, and yes, young men and women that I have talked to on so many college campuses across this country, in thinking about running for office, they're skeptical, because they don't believe that they can be effective or have an impact on the world around them, and therefore do not see attaining public office as a desirable or a viable option for that future. And you'll hear today about the polling that the USA Today did in conjunction with the Bipartisan Policy Center that underscores that unfortunate fact as well. It's a national travesty, and it's one that we must change. So these conversations today and the subsequent ones are really important, because we have to determine how we can change, under the rubric of that change, what we can do to change not only the poisonous political environment, but also how in attaining public office, or working in government, really has to be restored and once again regarded as the means by which we meet monumental challenges and forge great achievements. Obviously, the realm of public service also encapsulates more than just running for office or serving in government. And that fact is illustrated perfectly by our keynote speaker here this afternoon, whom we're very fortunate to have, the former CEO and the current executive chair of the PNC Financial Services Group, Jim Rohr. And Jim Rohr really does exemplify the best and the highest ideals of public service through building private-public partnerships. And it is a story that deserves not only to be told, but to be replicated. Jim Rohr really forged a very strong example through PNC's program entitled Grow Up Great. And it's the company's $350 million multi-year initiative, a bilingual program that started in 2004 to implement early childhood education. But Jim wasn't content enough just to initiate the idea. He also championed the importance and the significance of it to organizations across this country, and even testified before the Congress. Now, that's true commitment. But beyond Grow Up Great, he's been involved in so many other spheres of life. He is the president of the Federal Advisory Council and the Federal Reserve System. He's been involved and engaged in numerous cultural, educational, and civic organizations where he has garnered distinction and recognitions in the form of the Horatio Alger Distinguished Citizens Award, the Woodrow Wilson Corporate Citizenry Award. The PNC has been awarded excellence in corporate philanthropy because of his extraordinary commitment to early childhood education, to the Sesame Workshop Honoree Award. And during his tenure as CEO at PNC, he was named his company was named the Gallup Great Workplace Award and Working Mother's 100 Best Companies. Well, it doesn't get better than that. Jim Rohr exemplifies and personifies the notion of public service at its finest, at its brightest, and its broadest facets. And his contributions truly do shine a spotlight on how one person can make a difference, because Jim Rohr has. Please give a very warm welcome to Jim Rohr.
Wow, this is my best day. What a wonderful introduction. Love to can that one. There's a lot of people who would probably disagree with it. But anyway, thank you very, very much, Senator. And to have you go on about me like that is a great honor and a privilege. And with your unbelievable career in the Senate, we have to thank you for that and congratulate you for it. But more importantly, congratulate you and thank you for what you're continuing to do, bringing the bipartisan nature of your office to the country and continuing to do that. So thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for Senator Snowe, please? It's great to be here at a time, when bipartisanship is so important, and there's a number of things I think that we have to think about ourselves in order to make sure that our country gets back on the track that we had been for a long time. I want to thank the people that are here because this is a commitment to America. If you're committing to a bipartisanship, that is the nature of the country. And when you stop and think about Senator Snowe said about what took place here a couple of years ago, with the characters that showed up here and rode their horses to town to negotiate what the government must be. Can you imagine what it would be like if you rode your horse all the way from Virginia? What kind of mood you'd be in? And then you've got other people coming from Boston and elsewhere. And if you saw the John Adams movie, I mean, these people were not of common belief. They were the most disparate group of people you could ever imagine, coming from different countries, different backgrounds, different everything. They had different reasons to be here. And yet they came together here in Philadelphia and met in a bipartisan way and forged what is our Constitution and is the beginning of our country. It's amazing that these people work together like that, and frankly, they created something very, very special. And I think sometimes we have to remind ourselves how that was done. It was not done easily. It was not done easily, but it took some great leadership, a great deal of compromising in order to get it right for the majority of the people of this country. Now, you're here for this bipartisan program, so I'm probably shedding light where there is no darkness. You people have already bought in, but I just thought that I would. We all have worked together on teams, and we've all partnered, and we know that teams and partnerships actually are able to accomplish a great deal more. So I pulled some comments that came out of the Congress lately that I thought were great team building comments. You've probably heard these. I thought of that already. You know, that makes you. I don't need your help. Quote. Stand back and let me show you how to do this. That always really brings the team together. And if I needed your help, I would have asked for it. I think that's another nice comment that came out. Those are all quotes from the last 2 weeks. So I want to make sure that we're not using old things. But there's no question that the divisiveness of politics has been an inhibitor to constructive dialogue, which I think is critically important for the future of this country. And we will not get to where we need to be without actually setting aside some of our partisanship in order to seek the solutions for a common agenda on the things that really matter. really matter. There's a lot of things that we talk about, and there's a whole series of issues. If you pick up every blog, there's a lot of things we talk about every day, and there's a lot of discussion about a lot of things, but we seem to miss our focus sometimes on the things that were really, really important. Now, I'm a little pessimistic about some of the trends, and we'll talk about a couple of those things, but I'm a pretty positive guy. I'm a person that really is a result of the American dream. A number of years ago, a grandfather came over on a boat from Alsace-Lorraine, spoke French. I don't know why he came, never met him. Went to Cleveland for some reason, no idea. Still don't know why. Anyways, he got a job as a cook in a hotel. My grandmother, who I never met, came over from Ireland, got a job doing the laundry in the hotel. I've seen pictures of these people, relatively ordinary people. My grandmother was not quite so ordinary. She was about 4'11" in diameter. But anyway, that's how I got this way. But anyway, I love that woman. They had one child. That child never spoke Gaelic, never spoke French, only spoke English. And the commitment was that child was going to go to school, and that child was going to go to college. And he did go to college, and he was my father, and he had our family. He was a very hard-working person. He built a restaurant. He passed away when I was 10, but he gave me the opportunity to work in the restaurant, work on a farm, and you got the idea of how to work hard, because that was the culture of his family. That was the culture of his family. So I was fortunate enough to go to Notre Dame and work my way through Ohio State, and since then I got interviewed on the campus of Ohio State, and 40 years later I was still at the bank and had a wonderful career and a wonderful family. So I have a lot of reasons to be positive. I'm probably, the American dream in many ways. And one of the things that you get to learn about building a company and working with a company is how important that education is, but how important it is to build a team. How important it is to have a diverse group of people around you in order to have diverse ideas, and how they have to forge together to work together as a team. And so you have to really be able to forge that team. I think about a speech that was made many years ago here, which was just celebrated recently, when Abraham Lincoln made his wonderful speech at the Gettysburg Address. But when he put his cabinet together, it was a team of rivals. These were very accomplished people in their own right and remarkably diverse in opinion, and in many cases, his opponents. But he put together what he thought was the best cabinet. And somehow, the team of rivals came together at a very important time in our country's history, and it was a key to forging who we are today. And it is about working together as a team and having people discuss things from a bipartisan point of view. Also, to be successful, you have to be honest as a team. You have to be honest. You have to take a hard look. You have to take a hard look at the issues that are really important. You have to use facts. Sometimes we don't like to use facts. If there's a big challenge, we don't like to look at the facts. We want to put it aside and hope it gets better and say it's politically incorrect to discuss that in that way because it's easier to deal with it that way. But the fact of the matter is, when you put your big challenges aside, they don't get fixed. They actually get worse. And then you end up having, why do we always say it takes a crisis to fix things? Then you have to have a crisis. But leadership, frankly, allows you to not have to do that if you have some foresight and you have people who actually talk about the facts of the issue and deal with them in advance. So that's what this event is about, is dealing with things in advance. But I'd like to talk about two big challenges where I think that we're dropping the ball. And you could actually become pessimistic about these things. But I think, frankly, with leadership and the kind of bipartisan program you're having today, I think we can get out ahead of this and actually fix it, which will have far-reaching effects to our country for many years. Let's start with the hard truth. They give you a tough one. We are failing our children. We are failing the next generation. Why do I say that? We're going to give the next generation somewhere between $17 and $20 trillion worth of debt. We didn't inherit $17 trillion worth of debt. The debt has doubled in 6 years. We didn't inherit that, but that's going to be a burden on the next generation. We're running deficits in excess of $1 trillion a year. The Federal Reserve has bought has grown their balance sheet from $600 billion to over $3 trillion in order to keep interest rates low, down below 1%. If you assume that interest rates go back to where they normally would be, given this inflation, that would be 4%. And that move from 1% to 4% would be another $500 billion a year in interest payments on our debt. It's a fact. It's just a fact. It's numeric. But we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to discuss it. It's a very, very difficult issue. And that debt continues to grow. Right now, every child that's born inherits what is the equivalent of $50,000 of the national debt. And it's very, very difficult. So I think these are things that we can deal with. I think these are things that will be a burden to the next generation. But we have to get out in front of them. They were short-term solutions. Let me say that buying down the interest rates was good for coming out of the recession. I think the Fed did the right thing. And the government spending. We can argue about how much money was spent by the government. But frankly, you could not cut public spending at that time. So the spending was a good thing. You can argue about whether it was too much or not. But we have to stop it now. It's a short-term fix, and we have to stop it, and we have to come together in order to deal with this. Our debt to GDP ratio is 75% today. 5 years ago, it was half of that. And we have the other issues with the baby boomers coming along with Medicare and Social Security and other entitlements that are going to make it more difficult. But if we pass this, if we pass on this, that we, as they say in Washington, kick the can down the road, the issue will get bigger rather than smaller. The debt will get larger rather than smaller, and it will be more difficult to deal with. And so I think this is a critical area where we have to come together, and we have to come together in a way that we haven't come together in the past, and look at our expenses. I learned it as a banker many years ago. This is a believe it or not question. When I was first in the bank, there was a fellow that couldn't pay his loan. He was a doctor making $1 million a year in 1973. That's impossible in Steubenville, Ohio. How could that be possible? And he's borrowing money, couldn't pay his debt. I found out he was spending more than $1 million a year. That's why he couldn't pay his debt. So it's really not about how much you make. It's about how much you spend. And so we have to come together and deal with this now by reducing our spending and adjusting our tax rates. We can do that without having a crisis, and I think help the next generation and turn over a more fiscally sound country to the next generation. Secondly is education. In 1979, we created a large federal agency to oversee the education policy for the nation and to ensure, quote, the preeminence of America's students against global competition for the foreseeable future. We funded it. Last year, the budget for the Department of Education was $70 billion. But test results tell us that the U.S. still lags behind in reading, math, and science. And high school graduation rates aren't improving. They're somewhere in the low 70s, and that's okay with us. Now, are these standards okay that 27% of our high school students don't graduate high school? Very, very difficult burden on the future of the country. When you look in urban areas and among minorities in those urban areas, the rate plummets. A study a couple of years ago by American Promise revealed that the graduation rate in the nation's 50 largest cities was closer to 50%. The city I grew up in Cleveland, less than 55% of the students in the MSA graduate high school, and only 40% of the students in the city limits graduate. 60% of those kids don't graduate from high school. What are their opportunities? The numbers shift a bit from region to region, but the same story plays out across the country. And how do we expect our children and grandchildren to succeed in life with that kind of a burden that they're inheriting from us? Now, the fundamental idea of what it means to be American, the thought that any child who can dream will have the opportunity to pursue that dream and perhaps achieve it if they're fortunate. Yet here in Philadelphia and across the country, there are too many children that are born into families who no longer believe in the American dream because the burden, as they define it, is unattainable. The burden is too difficult. The distance is too great. But we know, frankly, now from studies that came out about 10 to 12 years ago, and it takes 30 years to do these studies, that the surest, most effective way to provide children with the opportunity to rise above these circumstances is early childhood education. Successful children grow up to be successful adults. Starts with school readiness. And that readiness translates over years in higher educational attainment, better qualified workers, increased earnings, and the rest. It all makes sense. But children who are not prepared when they come to kindergarten are in very, very difficult shape. They're 40% less likely to need special education or to be held back a grade, and they're 70% less likely to commit a violent crime by the age of 18. They're also more likely to graduate high school, to go on to college, some sound employment, contribute to the economy. Just imagine what Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Detroit would look like if all the children were ready for school when they came to kindergarten. Instead, we're throwing billions of dollars at a system that just tries to work with children who are unprepared to go to school. Jim Heckman, one of the top economists in the country at the University of Chicago, did a number of studies, and he recently revealed some truths about our public education system. And the fact of the matter is that children without access, underserved children without access to early childhood education, show up at kindergarten 18 months less prepared than their counterpart. In other words, they have 25 to 50% lower vocabulary than the average child. From that point forward, the gap grows. Doesn't narrow, the gap grows. Think about it. If you understand 25 or 50% less than the kid next to you, you're going to learn at a slower rate. There's no question. And the gap grows. And I think, frankly, it shows that when the children that turn 18, so these are the kids that actually go through all the way through high school, the gap is still the same or greater. Never mind the kids that have already dropped out. Now we've approved a lot of things like Pell Grants, $40 billion last year for Pell Grants, which is terrific. It's for higher education, and that's great for our economy. But those grants can't help the nearly 60% of the disadvantaged children who fall behind, drop out, and don't even graduate high school. The only answer, is early childhood education. The Heckman study showed that for every dollar that we spend on early childhood education, we get $16 plus back in return as a society, in lower incarceration, welfare, and rehabilitation rates. Very, very, it's factual. The other fact is that many states in the country use fourth grade literacy as the single best predictor of the need for jail cells 20 years later. So it's a major issue for us, and it's an issue that we now know how to fix. At PNC, a number of years ago, we always gave back to the community, and we love being in Philadelphia, and the community was always part of the culture of the company. And we asked ourselves, if we focused on something, could we do a little better? And we thought we could if you focus. And so we asked our employees what it is that they thought was important. They said children and education. And we were fortunate at that time that these studies, these 30-year studies, were coming out talking about how important early childhood education was for the underserved. And so we created what is called Grow Up Great, and we've had a wonderful experience here in Philadelphia with it. It's a $350 million initiative that supports innovative programs throughout the communities in math, science, and vocabulary. We emphasize the importance of the first 5 years and provide innovative opportunities that assist families, educators, and community partners to enhance children's learning and development. What we did is we partnered. We're not in the education business, we're partners. So we partnered with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, we partnered with Sesame, we partnered with Head Start. And we use with a number of partners here in Philadelphia that we partner with. We supply money to early childhood centers because we're not in that business. And we partner with different community organizations who work with those early childhood centers. And then our employees volunteer. And they think a lot of it. As a matter of fact, our employees now, more than 27% of our 56,000 employees volunteer time in early childhood centers. They've contributed more than 350,000 hours at early childhood centers and donated more than 500,000 items to childhood centers themselves. And they feel really great about being part of it. To date, the program has served approximately 2 million children. And we have evidence, especially here in Philadelphia for math and science, where we keep track, but also for vocabulary, of significant improvements in the kids' learning ability from year to year. But the challenge is far greater than any one company can reasonably tackle. I mean, we have to face it and solve it as a nation. The State of the Union address, I think this year by the President, really echoed the call that a number of us have been making for some time for universal access to early childhood education programming. But in this case, there's no one size fits all. There's no one size fits all. Each community is different. And I think we need to make tough decisions about how we fund these programs because, for example, they have to be funded locally and done differently and face the harsh realities of the growing deficits that the local communities have already. Today, most states don't require that all children be offered preschool, but a handful do, and a handful have no preschool at all already. Families with the financial resources tend to place their children in preschool, but low to moderate income families have trouble affording it and need assistance to cover the costs. We talk about a widening gap between the achievements of the rich and poor. So this is where it begins at the beginning. Early childhood education is the on-ramp to social mobility in America, and we have to make it accessible to everybody. We need to find ways to make the necessary investments. I think that was the Jim Heckman study that showed this dollar that we give to early childhood education, it's not an expense, it's an investment in our future, in our kids' future. And I think we also have to look at the least costly ways. There's a number of ways to do it, and there's a lot of panels, but it's not really a liberal or conservative debate, really. It's a matter of right and wrong. We know that the current system struggles to deal with children who come in that are underserved and haven't had that early education. It's been tried and it's failed. But I think, frankly, when you look at the different programs around the country that are starting to build up, you see that there's some real hope. For Ohio, for instance, there's a number of subsidized child care systems and early education programs. When the Public Early Learning Initiative was defunded in 2011, it cost $10,500. A child care provider in a quality care center is $1,500 less. If you do it on a home care center basis, it's $3,000 per child. In Indiana, the Mind Trust has offered a plan to provide pre-K for all 4-year-olds in the Indiana public school system. More is required, but it's a sizable step towards closing the early childhood learning gap among students in the district. These are only a couple of examples of programs that work. There are lots of programs that work across the country, but we have to really step forward on a bipartisan basis and recognize how important this is. Here in Pennsylvania, Governor Rendell put it in his budget when he was there. Governor Corbett, even though he had to cut his budget dramatically, actually increased the early childhood money in Pennsylvania. And a number of governors across the states have done this, but it has to really go to a national mandate. And how we do it is another question. I think we can do it locally, but it has to be recognized as something that we have to do nationally to solve this graduation rate problem. Now, being involved in this and knowing that we're making a difference, frankly, at PNC is one of the very best things that ever happened to me in my career. The idea that 2 million children are a little bit better off because of what we did is very important. And I think I encourage you to see how you can get engaged in the early childhood debate to restore faith in the achievability of the American dream for every American child. Write op-eds and letters to the editor in favor of pre-K education. Speak to businesses and leaders in your community about the importance, and partner with different people and team with different people, because that's where we're much more effective. And I think organizations like the Committee for Economic Development has really had a great deal of publications that have really focused on this issue and taken us forward. So I think sometimes we sit back and we say these problems are very large and they're very difficult to solve. But I think that there's no question in our country we have the resources to deal with these issues. We've had much tougher issues, frankly, than in the past. But I think we have to look at the next generation. We have to say to ourselves, we can't give them $20 trillion worth of debt. Wouldn't be appropriate. We can't give them the burden of such a significant number of children who are not going to graduate from high school and not ever be able to compete in the global economy. We can deal with those issues. The people that came here in Philadelphia had bigger issues than those, but they came together in a bipartisan way, and they discussed it vehemently, just as we have to discuss the debt and our entitlements and our tax position and our early childhood education policy and work it out. And on a bipartisan way, and I told you before, I'm an optimist. I don't think there's any question the leadership of this country can come together on these two major issues. Because if we don't solve these two, the rest of our issues don't matter. The country's bankrupt, and the rest of the issues don't matter. We will have a crisis that will be almost impossible to deal with. But I think the leadership and a bipartisan nation can come together and focus on these two big issues and make sure that every young child can pursue their American dream. Thank you very, very much for being here today. Thank you. Now, please join me in welcoming your moderator for the next session. She is the Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, Susan Page. Susan?
Good afternoon. What a privilege it is to be at this historic place at this important moment in our nation's history. USA Today is delighted to be working with the Bipartisan Policy Center and its Commission on Political Reform on the big challenges facing our government and our country, which are apparent almost every day just 150 miles down the road in Washington, D.C. Let me introduce our impressive group of panelists, members of the Bipartisan Policy Commission's Commission on Political Reform. John Bridgeland, former director of the White House Domestic Policy Council and USA Freedom Corps. Mark Gearan, former director of the Peace Corps and president of Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Hi. Eric Motley, vice president of the Aspen Institute and former head of the White House Personnel Office. Todd Bernstein, president of Global Citizen. Margaret Spellings, former secretary of Education. Trent Lott, former U.S. Senate Majority Leader and co-chair of the Commission on Political Reform. Vicki Kennedy, co-founder of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. Karen Hughes, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs. And Chris Marvin, U.S. Army retired and Managing Director of Got Your Six campaign. You can read more complete bios in the programs for our panelists. Now, we invite everyone here at the National Constitution Center, or people watching us on our webcast, to join our conversation. If you're physically here, you can fill out one of these cards that were at your seats with your comment or your question. And if you're digitally here, send us an email or a tweet. Our Twitter handle is BPC_bipartisan. Use the hashtag EngageUSA. I'll ask some of your questions and read some of your comments through our conversation. Before we begin, here's a quick video that my colleagues at USA Today, Shannon Green and Eliza Collins, made for this event. It features some faces you're likely to recognize. Let's watch. I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today. It's long been a truism for proud parents across the country. Their child could grow up to be president. But is that really something Americans still aspire to? For many, attitudes toward politicians and political office, from the local school board to the White House, have soured. Dan Glickman should know. He served for 9 terms as a congressman from Kansas and then as agriculture secretary in President Clinton's cabinet. He now co-chairs the Commission on Political Reform for the Bipartisan Policy Center.
I first ran for Congress, which was 1976. To me, it was a glory job. It was the greatest job in the world, being a congressman, a senator, and we had very prestigious people in those positions. They were well thought of. They were put on pedestals. I mean, whether it was always justified or not, that was a secondary question. The media was generally more predisposed towards reporting positive stories. The attitude by the opposition was not kill at all costs. And so at worst, politicians were viewed neutrally. And at best, they were viewed positively. And that is just so much different than today.
In a new national poll taken for USA Today and the Bipartisan Policy Center, the overwhelming majority of Americans say they've never seriously considered running for public office at any level. They say they aren't that interested in politics, that politics is too vicious, and that it would be a waste of time because politicians can't get anything done. 3 of 4 Americans aren't particularly interested in other forms of civic involvement either, like serving on a jury. Being involved in government and politics was never easy. These days, it's gotten harder.
I think the biggest hurdle that people would have to overcome in running for office is obviously the deep concern about raising so much money. And there's so much money in the political system, which obviously has to change. I know many people have raised the question about the amount of money, but also the negative ads and the negative campaign and exposing themselves and their families.
I tell some of my colleagues and candidates, what you say in your district 2,000 miles away is 144 characters in the speed of light away from every one of us. It's called Twitter. That didn't exist. The internet didn't exist. My dad ran for the legislature in 1970. Now, we watched Watergate. There were, riots in Chicago for the Democratic Convention not long after, in 68. All these things going. It was a rough and tumble business. But now everything's immediate. Everything's very open and transparent. And so your time to really think through things is shrunk down.
Running for office isn't the only way to help your community, of course. More than 4 in 10 of the people we surveyed say they're very interested in volunteering at their place of worship, at a school, or at a homeless shelter. By more than 2 to 1, they say the best way to make positive changes in our society is through local charities and faith-based operations, not through government. They wonder if in the State House or the Capitol they could get things done. They wonder if it's worth trying.
I don't blame people for being frustrated. I don't blame them for being sour on public service. You turn on television and there's a personal attack.
When Mitt Romney was governor, Massachusetts lost 40,000 manufacturing jobs.
Obama, failing to stop cheating, failing American workers.
You tell your children, don't go near the mailbox. It's the most dangerous place in America. Does that become a real disincentive to running? The fact is, of course it does. Who would want to put themselves through that kind of life? I'll tell you who. People who are willing to take hits, even though they're unfair, to solve America's problems. People are willing to put up and endure with that kind of behavior because they know that there's a greater goal worth achieving.
The only way that you're really going to give people some belief that the system works is that if you can work on the substantive problems. The process issues are interesting. Let's say how Congress works and issues like the filibuster and issues like reform on the Hill, so to speak. But to make the American people believe that the system is on the level, you got to get these problems resolved. You got to do things, especially doing big things. It was Daniel Burnham, the famous architect, who once said, "Make no little plans, for they do not have the power to stir men's souls." We've got to stir people's souls up.
Now, we heard Dan Glickman say in the interview for this video that many no longer see public service as an honorable profession. I'd like to say that is not true for us here today. So let me start by thanking everyone on our panel for their service to the U.S. Senate and the White House and the State Department, the Education Department, and the military and the Peace Corps, and in the world of nonprofit organizations. Thank you for your service. Now, I'm going to pose some questions to particular people, but I would invite our panelists to feel free to jump in with their own comments or objections or questions, like I could stop you if you wanted to do it anyway. So let me start with down at the other end with Mark Gearan and John Bridgeland. We found in our national poll changing attitudes toward the value of politics and government service. Now, you've each had long careers in public service. Have you seen changing attitudes yourself toward public service, and especially among younger people?
I guess I'll begin, and thank you for this panel and that wonderful video. I make it a habit across the country when I speak with college students on college campuses to ask them a number of questions. And the first question I ask is, how many of you want to run for public office? And I get this wonderful woman from Iran who will raise her hand and is going to do so. But most of the young people don't raise their hand. And I say, how many of you would like to be appointed to some office in the White House? And maybe you get a few hands. And then I ask, how many of you would like to work for a nonprofit or start your own enterprise to affect change? And every hand in the room goes up. And I think this millennial generation, which is showing civic habits on par with the greatest generation in terms of their interest in issues, their willingness to volunteer, their willingness to serve, is very impatient for impact. But what worries me is when Jim outlined the 3 issues that are the most serious for the country, addressing our national debt, closing achievement gaps, and boosting economic mobility, government has to play a role on each one of those issues to affect change at scale. And so the issue, I think, is how do we ensure that we take this energy and aptitude of millennials who want to serve their country in some way, and their interest in national service, to take one example, is off the charts. How do we also awaken in them the fact that through government service, they can work together across party, race, ethnicity, income, people of different backgrounds to affect change?
Yeah, I would agree with Bridge, and I offer my perspective as a college president, as a former director of the Peace Corps, and chairing the board of the Corporation for National Community Service. I think the millennial generations are the most civically engaged and service-oriented, like Bridge said, since the greatest generation. You see it quantitatively in the numbers of students volunteering on their campuses, wanting to join the Peace Corps. Teach for America and AmeriCorps are highly prestigious, sought-after positions. So the millennials are a very interesting generation. The genius of this effort with the Bipartisan Policy Center and our commission is, how do we think about pathways for service to capture that sense of idealism? My own observation is it is a very pragmatic sense of idealism, very direct. That's why Habitat for Humanity is popular, or AmeriCorps, or Peace Corps. Direct impact locally in their communities where they can really make a difference. The good news is this is a generation with highly idealistic aspirations, a commitment to our country, but they want to see reality-based programs and solutions to do it. How we organize for that, prepare this generation, is an important part of our task.
Karen, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I think part of it is that young people want to make a tangible difference. I spent the spring at Harvard's Institute of Politics, and a lot of the young people there are very interested in public service. They have a lot of questions about running for office and about whether you really can bring about change. I was sharing with my colleagues earlier this morning that in my service in government, particularly at the State Department, I had the opportunity to meet some wonderful career civil servants and foreign service officers who've spent their entire career and done amazing things. And I don't think those stories are heard as loudly. I mean, imagine watching the Iron Curtain fall and helping democracy be established in countries. Imagine a friend of John Bridgeland who heard about eradicating polio in a country. The opportunities, I think, that people have to serve and to make an impact and to make that tangible difference can be very great in government. And I think we need to do a better job of sharing that more broadly with a wider group of American citizens.
Chris Marvin, you're a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. Thank you for your service. And managing director of Got Your Six, a campaign to help bridge the gap between the military and civilians. Now, here's a question we got on our website from Patrick, who identifies himself as a U.S. Army veteran. He asked, should military or some form of similar service be required to hold office, since teamwork is paramount? And I'd note also that in today's Huffington Post, you wrote an article that argued if we had more military veterans in Congress, we would have fewer of these nuclear option showdowns. Why do you think that would be the case?
Yeah, well, excuse me. Thanks for the question, Susan and Patrick. You know, I'm honored to be part of this commission to represent veterans, also to represent the city of Philadelphia, where I live, and thank you, all the Philadelphians who came out to watch us today. It's a good question, and Patrick's question makes sense. This idea that that veterans in Congress might allow congressmen and women to act in a more bipartisan manner. Right? Veterans have been trained to be leaders and team builders and problem solvers, and when they make it to Capitol Hill, that's precisely what they do. 35 years ago, 75% of Congress had served in the military. Today, it's below 20%. Now, part of that is a numbers game and demographics and those who served in World War II. We had a much larger cohort of veterans then. But part of it is also that veterans aren't being elected to Congress even right now as fast as they're leaving or losing races or retiring. We had a net loss of, I think, 11 veterans in Congress last November, and then we had 2 of our most long-serving veterans in the Senate pass away since the election. So we're right about 100 veterans in Congress right now. Those people are the ones we should look to for this leadership. Mr. Rohr had a comment about, he had those quotes from Congress that were, we said they were sort of the quotes that the way you wouldn't teach your children to cooperate in kindergarten. But wouldn't it be amazing if we had a place where we could send future leaders to learn how to be good team players, to learn how to solve problems and to teach them about leadership? Well, we do. It's called the United States military, and we graduate 250,000 people every year from that leadership institution. So I think it's really important that we not only think about getting more veterans into Congress to promote bipartisanship, but even today, looking to the veterans who are in Congress for some of these solutions. We have 12 amazing new veterans who just joined the House, and amongst them we have the first 2 female combat veterans to serve in Congress. We have Purple Heart winners. We have world record-setting aviators, and these people are amazing and accomplished, and they've seen through their military service that it's important to be part of something bigger than yourself and to serve a purpose, and they carry that forward, and it's very useful in our national leadership.
We have a question we want to pose to our online audience. Here's our question. Do you believe there are adequate opportunities for Americans to serve in their country and communities? And if you'd like to vote, go to bipartisanpolicy.org/EngageUSA, and we'll have the responses. We'll report the responses in just a few minutes. And you can always post a tweet or ask a question or make a comment. Just use the hashtag EngageUSA. Now, Vicki Kennedy, here's a question that's been submitted on Twitter by Women's Way, and here's what it says. Women are vastly underrepresented in government, skewing the dialogue. How do we make political office a safer place for women? And I would just note that we found in our nationwide poll an enormous gender gap when it came to elective office. 22% of the men we surveyed said they had seriously considered running for elective office because everyone knows men should be in charge, right? Just 8% of women said they had seriously considered running. That's bigger than the gap on that question by income or by education or by race. So is that something we should be concerned about? And if so, what can we do about it?
I think we have to do everything we can to see women more broadly represented in elective office. We are more than 50% of the population, but we are very much smaller percentage represented in elective office, both at the national level and in the local levels. You even look at cabinet officials. We've still just had so few in the history of our country women who have been in the cabinet. We're so lucky that we have Margaret Spellings here, who was our Secretary of Education with President Bush. But women are grossly underrepresented. And I think there are a lot of issues. I think a lot of it is raising money. I think it's the lifestyle of having to be on the road, away, raising money. I go back to raising money. The money race is enormous. But if you have more women whose voices are there, and I look at Olympia Snowe and how much the Senate misses her voice and her voice of moderation and reason being there, we're so lucky that you're still on the road giving your message, Olympia, and so happy to be a part of this commission here with you. We need women to temper the dialogue. I think women understand teamwork that we were just talking about. I think you need as many diverse points of view as possible. We need to have a conversation. And women tend to be pretty good at talking and having that conversation. I don't think there are easy answers to it. To call it a safer space, I'd welcome the other women here to talk about it. Margaret,
I was just going to say that, I think women, the opportunities for government, in government for women are amazing. In fact, when I think about my own career, people, ask me, I'm sure Karen and Vicki same, how do we get ahead in government? How do we get ahead in our careers? And I find that women can ascend to very senior leadership responsibility and management roles in the government that may have or may not have been available in the private sector. So it's a great place to build and nurture and foster a very significant and impactful career. And so I think we need to advertise, if you will, to women around young and old alike, that young and middle-aged alike, that the opportunities in government are terrific and a great place to have a very successful, very impactful, very interesting career. When I think about what we've learned from programs like Teach for America, obviously in our schools, they are dominated often by a female workforce. We've learned that when you pick excellent people and you send them together to a place, when Teach for America started, they would send one excellent teacher into a disadvantaged school, and that poor soul would wash out after a pretty short period of time. When you started to have 3 to 5 and more teachers, a group, into a school, then things really took off. All of those, largely women, stayed involved in education, became excellent consumers of education, went on to become principals and superintendents and made big careers because of this public service experience called Teach for America. I think we got to hook them early.
Senator Lott, I wonder, we heard Chris talk about the impact that having more veterans in politics might have, and now about the impact more women in politics might have. Do you think women as legislators tend to act differently than men? I mean, I'm thinking not in the salacious ways that are obviously going through the minds of our audience. I'm thinking, we now have 20 women in the U.S. Senate. That's a record. Are women more likely to cooperate with others, or is that not something you think really happens?
Well, first of all, you've just witnessed an unusual event. It's obvious I'm a former senator because I've been sitting here 20 minutes and haven't tried to dominate and filibuster the conversation. And I couldn't help but think as I listened to the questions and think about what we've been discussing before we came here today and even the answers. Even though I'm out of Congress now, I was a staff member as a Democrat for 4 years, I was a House member for 16, a senator for 19, worked with Olympia Snowe. Olympia Snowe was my chief deputy whip in the House of Representatives, first the highest ranking woman in Republican leadership up to that point. I'm just not as pessimistic as some of the things I hear here. The question is, are there enough opportunities in public service or elective office? Well, absolutely. If you want to take advantage of them, they're there all over the place. Now, maybe the fault is the marketing aspect, and I think Karen has talked about that. We need to do a better job of helping young people understand how do you prepare, be involved, be prepared to take advantage of the opportunity, making them aware of what you can do in federal government or elective office. Yeah, is it tough? Sure. Is it doubly tough for women? Yes, because, if you're going to be in Congress, you need to be in Washington, and quite often you've got a family back home. You maybe have another job. It's not something that pays a whole lot of money. So even though I was in on the high times of Congress when we got things done, and I was there during some of the low times, and I worry about where they are right now. But as Solomon would say, this too shall pass. If a lot of people, like those of you here in the room and people all over this country, will get involved and try to do more. Now, in answer to your question, Susan, thank you for being here. And one other thing. I'm excited to be here. This is hallowed ground, Philadelphia, what it's meant to the beginning of this country. And to be here with the Bipartisan Policy Center and to be in the National Constitution Center, this is really a great, beautiful, wonderful place, and we need to all come here and think about what happened here and what we're going to do to preserve this great young republic. Women do bring a different perspective, and I think that's good. I remember when I was a majority leader, I had a very homogeneous leadership group that quite often would make a decision. We were going in a particular direction, and we would be prepared to tear off in that direction. When somebody like Judd Gregg of New Hampshire or Slade Gordon of Washington State or Olympia would say, are you sure about that? Would you like to think about that a little more? And I made it a point of reaching out to the women in the Senate. I think Olympia would tell you that, and Dianne Feinstein would tell you that. I found them to be difficult and also helpful. So I don't have any problem, in fact, I'd like to see more women involved. But I do also think we have to acknowledge that it's harder for women sometimes because they do have quite, most of the time they have families, they have children, they have the possibilities of interruptions. And we have some women now in Congress that are having children and got one that's pregnant right now. And, I feel sorry for her in many respects because she's trying to do about 4 or 5 different tasks. But women have the ability to do that, which men don't. So I think it's good, but I don't think we should presume that they're gonna instantly bring great common sense to the institution. But what's going on in Washington now, and what you hear in the media, and what you hear from us about bipartisanship, and about partisanship, I got very frustrated myself about how difficult it got to be to get things done, and the negativity. If you make a mistake, you can just get hammered for days. But we're talking about that, thinking about that, and I believe that in the future we'll see a different attitude. Members of Congress know the American people are not happy. They know that. And I think with time, they will begin to make changes. So I could go on and give a filibuster, but somebody would invoke cloture on me, so I'll stop with that, Susan.
No issue that we're discussing today has gotten more activity on Twitter than this one on the disparity between men and women and their willingness to think about running for elective office. Here's one from Sharon Oliver, who's a member of the New Jersey General Assembly. She says, New Jersey sends 0 women to Congress. It doesn't sound like she thinks that's a good idea. We should note that New Hampshire no longer elects men to statewide office, in contrast. Here's a tweet we got commenting on that poll finding that only 8% of women have seriously considered running for office. Ainsley writes, I am the 8%. So thank you, Ainsley. Here's one from the Louisiana North Shore Democratic Women's Club. Step up. The only way to impact legislation that affects women is to be part of the process. And finally, this tweet from Chris. He writes, women clearly smarter than men. Todd Bernstein, what about the role of education? One of the pollsters who worked on our survey, Whit Ayers, said that his first job was teaching civics to 9th and 10th graders. He doesn't do that anymore. Does anyone do that anymore? Do we teach civics the way we should, the way we need to?
No, I don't think we do. If you take Philadelphia, where I grew up and do my work, there's a good news, bad news dichotomy. In 1998, the school district of Philadelphia did a groundbreaking thing of making civics and service learning a requirement for all students. And there are many students in the city of Philadelphia who come from underserved communities who are struggling and really don't have a sense of purpose, self-esteem, and a sense that there are opportunities for them. And what we've seen at Global Citizen through the King Day of Service and ongoing civic engagement is that this is a time for discovery. We've seen young people doing service and finding something from within themselves. So, there are wonderful initiatives, particularly for 18 to 25-year-olds, and John Bridgeland and Chris Marvin and others are working on this exciting initiative to allow greater capacity for Americans to serve either in the military or the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps. But I'm more concerned about how we're doing with young people. And when I say young people, I mean 8 years old, 9 years old, and that. Right now in Philadelphia, we're facing a terrible, terrible dilemma. We came out of this school year with a $304 million deficit, and in order to bridge that gap, we've gotten some money from the Commonwealth and from the city. But as a result of that, and it may be down to about $150 million right now, there are going to be no assistant principals, there are going to be no art teachers, no music teachers. There will be no sports programs. How many of you can think of the days of the kind of sense of teamwork that we had from having those opportunities? The situation in the Philadelphia School District, which now sees service learning totally eroding. What 15 years ago became great possibilities to engage young people now basically doesn't exist. And if we're concerned about young people wanting to go into government or the nonprofits, I think we need to start engaging them and challenging them to do good things for others at the earliest of age. But of course, the great surprise is the transformation that young people feel and the possibilities for discovery.
Margaret, did you want to weigh in on this? As a former education secretary, we ask our schools to do a lot. We want them to teach more math and science. We want them to teach healthier eating and exercise. Should civics be part of that?
Absolutely. And I think, while there is no federal mandate for that in our curriculum, and obviously those issues are decided by states, I think most states have some sort of civic education, civic engagement, and curriculum that speaks to this. One of the things I'm encouraged by is in the last National Education Report Card results, we started to see some increases in levels of civic literacy and civic engagement. So it's encouraging. I think the other thing that happens is we need to there are tons of resources available. The things that you're doing, the things that Justice O'Connor, many assets and tools available to our teachers to teach civic learning and civic social studies and the like, but they're not very well harnessed together. And maybe that's a role that we at the Bipartisan Policy Commission could start to create some toolkits to allow teachers to access some of these resources more easily. And we have to start with our teachers. I mean, we have to have our teacher colleges embed this in the preparation program so that they think it's important there as well.
Maybe you should talk to Whit Ayers about going back to his first love of civics education. Eric, I'm sorry, go ahead, Vicki.
It's also sort of how we talk about it, because there's something about when you say civics that people tune out and don't really think of it in terms of being active citizens. And if we think of it in terms of citizenship and our responsibilities of citizenship and understanding what our government is, and here we are in Philadelphia, where we had our constitutional convention, and I can't help but think about that famous line of Benjamin Franklin as he was leaving the constitutional convention and was asked, "What do you have, sir, a monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it. And the only way you can keep it is if you understand what your government is and what your responsibilities are to your government." And he believed that citizens had an obligation to give back to the government. And it goes back to the service that you're talking about, that we all care so passionately about. It goes back to service learning at the earliest years, incorporating service into the curriculum, and really from the earliest years, teamwork, that first question, building teams through service, whether it's in the military, whether it's in civilian service, and that just filters up, really, into this whole notion of not worrying about parties, not worrying about those labels, so that when hopefully you do run for elective office and get into Congress, you're able to build that kind of teamwork and you become active citizens. And I mean, maybe this is just my dream world of what we could have, but I think it all goes back to that early active citizenship and understanding of civics.
But it's absolutely true. When you're serving next to somebody at a homeless kitchen, you really don't think about, are they a Republican or a Democrat? You're engaged in something that brings you together. And I think part of what we want to do is we've lost some of the things that unite us as a country, as a people, and we need to reclaim that national unity and sense of shared purpose.
Eric Motley, you were special assistant to President George W. Bush for presidential personnel, which made you an extremely popular man in Washington for a while. When you went to people, there were a lot of people who wanted appointments. But what about people that the president, the administration wanted in key jobs? They were reluctant to do so. What made them reluctant? What are the obstacles to getting the best people into government?
I think most of the obstacles And I should say that I had a boss who said to me, to all the staff, there were two things that he said that really stuck with me. One was, you're not important, the work you're doing is important. And the second thing he said was, when you leave presidential personnel and you leave the White House, be sure to get a dog. Because you'll want someone to love you and to care for you. The invitations will stop. You'll be less popular. This was Clay Johnson. Get a dog. I had one of the best jobs in government because men and women sought us out daily to serve. And we sought men and women out all across the country. There were tens of thousands of resumes that came in every day, from college students to citizens in Montgomery, Alabama, to retired veterans. There are 1.9 million jobs in the federal government. 4,500 of those are politically appointed. There are 250 boards and commissions. These are part-time jobs where men and women can serve free of charge, without any compensation, all across the country on arts boards, science boards, river and fishery boards, sewage boards, you name it. There's a board for you out there. And every day, people were phoning and coming by our office wanting to serve. And but one of the great impediments was the appointments process, the process of going through the paperwork, the process of being confirmed for Senate appointments, the multitude of disclosure forms that you had to submit. And there have been many attempts to reform that process. I now, along with a number of people, Margaret Spellings, sit on a commission looking at ways that we can reform the political appointments process to make it less laborious. But even though we had a very laborious process, people still wanted to serve. And I'm not convinced that it discouraged people from wanting to serve. And I think we've been talking about the branding of service. There are countless jobs and fellowship programs in the federal government, management fellowship programs, White House fellowship programs at NIH, at the National Endowment for the Arts. You name it, you could do it. And I think there are so many people who are just unaware of what great opportunities there are and how diverse those opportunities are in the federal government. We need a campaign to say, this is your country, these are great opportunities to serve. Did you know that you could serve in the arts and humanities in the federal government? Did you know that you could serve as a research assistant at NIH? Did you know that you could serve at the Interior Department working on fishery issues? I think that's a part of our challenge. That's part of our opportunity, is to help people to appreciate how great it is to serve and what many opportunities there are to serve in the government.
So nine people on this panel. How many of you have had jobs that required you to get Senate confirmation? Just a show of hands. So we've had 3. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how onerous was that process, Mark?
Well, I don't disagree with Eric that it's necessarily discouraging people from serving, but it is interrupting the effective execution of government and agencies. I was confirmed, thank you, Senator Lott, to be the director of the Peace Corps and twice more to serve on the Corporation for National Community Service Board. And it is rigorous. I think there has to be transparency, and we want good ethical standards for government service. But the process is laborious. The paperwork could be streamlined, which your commission has done wonderful work to go at. But I don't know that it's less about retarding service as the execution of effective government service. That's what I would be concerned about. I am a college president, and for this confirmation process, they will send the FBI to your office to ask questions. And they asked me, well, we'd like to speak with your neighbors. Well, I live next to a fraternity. And I said, fine. I would go knock on the door.
Wake them up.
Right. But query are all the levels of a full-time position, like a Peace Corps director or cabinet posts, versus a commission that's meeting 3 times a year, require the kind of levels of inquiry that are appropriate to an honest, ethical government service.
So the other 2 people who've been
Well, I think at the cabinet level, since I'd served at the White House for 4 years and had the good sense to make friends with Senator Ted Kennedy, whom I'd worked with on a lot of education policy matters and sought bipartisan support, I think, for myself, it was not all that difficult. I certainly saw
in staffing a large agency, how onerous it was for many people, both in terms of the paperwork and the backlog and just the food grinder that people have to go through to get to Senate confirmation. So it is quite onerous.
And Karen?
Well, I was the same way. I had served at the White House previously, so the FBI had already investigated me and talked to all my neighbors and friends, and I'd had to dig through and find out everywhere I'd lived in my life, which was very hard since my dad was in the Army. It was kind of hard to figure out all those old addresses. But, it can be a lengthy process, and I think I was fortunate also. Vice President Biden was in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time I was confirmed, and I had bipartisan support as well. So in my case, I actually thought it was a very constructive opportunity to sit down with members of the Senate who really cared about public diplomacy and America's image around the world, and who had spent years working on that issue and were able to share a lot of insight and knowledge with me. But I did see also, like Margaret did at Education at State, I saw how difficult it could sometimes be to bring people in lengthy waiting periods. And so when I left at the State Department, I think it took 8 months for another appointee to be named and put through the process and confirmed. And so you end up with big gaps of time in which these important jobs are sometimes not filled. And that's not, I don't think, the most effective way to govern.
Let's report on the results of our first online audience question. Remember, we asked if there were adequate opportunities for public service, and here's what you told us. 64% yes, 36% no. We're going to ask a second question now. Do you favor programs that pay for education costs in exchange for public service, like the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps? You can vote on our website, bipartisanpolicy.org/EngageUSA. Well, Karen, you did work for the State Department. You saw politics in other countries. Are American attitudes toward public service different from other countries?
I think that Americans' attitude towards service is different, and in a very positive way. I mean, one of the things that struck me across our country during the presidential campaign, but across the world as Undersecretary of State, was everywhere I went, there were Americans engaged and involved and giving of themselves to help other people, whether it was, church congregations, religious congregations, individual Americans. I remember seeing a young college student holding the hand of a man who was dying of AIDS in Africa, doctors who went to disasters around the world to serve, a hospital ship full of volunteer nurses and doctors, providing health care in Latin America. I mean, it really was a powerful testimony. And one of the things we tried to do in public diplomacy was to share that American sense of service and of giving back, and to teach that in communities around the world, where we would try to get local people involved in volunteer efforts that are so much a part of the fabric of American life. It really made me proud to be an American, to see the good and the way Americans across the world were working to expand opportunity, whether through the government or the private sector or through our charitable and religious congregations.
Now, some of our commissioners had lunch today with some young people from Philadelphia and Washington who are also in our audience. And one of them has sent up a question saying, Joseph, who's with Young Democrats of America, asked, one's faith, values, and religion forms our priorities, but is faith contributing to the polarization that is dividing the nation? John Bridgeland, what do you think?
I don't think it has to. I mean, there are wonderful efforts. Ibu Patel has this effort called the Interfaith Youth Corps, and he brings people together, Christian, Muslim, all sorts of faiths, together in common purpose. They actually don't begin by talking about faith. They begin by serving side by side to solve problems in local communities. And then they come together to talk about, well, what was it about your faith? What was it about your Christian faith that brought you here? Or your belief in Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam that brought you here? And all of a sudden they start to understand that all the world's great religions have charity and service and compassion and a willingness to give back to one another as fundamental tenets. And when you look around the world at how, these hotspots in the world where people are literally warring in the names of faiths that fundamentally have at their core common tenets, you see the power of not only interfaith dialogue, but interfaith action. I also think President Bush started the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiative because when we looked across the country and talking to these young people today, you see these individual citizens stepping forward to tackle great needs in communities. More often than not, we saw people were working through faith-based institutions. And so he tried to harness that power, and encouragingly, President Obama continued the office because he too saw the power of and the role of faith-based institutions in helping the poor and the needy in this country.
And it's actually interesting, across the world, I found that a lot of people mistook our American freedom of religion to mean freedom from religion. They don't understand that for many Americans, faith is a very important part of their lives. And so President Bush asked me to engage in interfaith dialogue, and it was really a wonderful conversation opener to say, I'm a Christian, other people in my government are of different faiths or maybe no faith at all. But to speak with people of different faiths across the world and talk about what we did have in common. I mean, almost every faith, the highest priority in my faith is love God and love your neighbor. And I found that many Muslims across the world believed that those were their highest priorities as well, and it opened the door to some very wonderful conversations.
Faith shouldn't be a problem. It should be part of the solution, unless it's used to, to oppress or, prevent a free and open and a society. I always had my greatest respect for men and women of faith, whether it was Joe Lieberman, that I admired greatly, because he wouldn't campaign on a Saturday. That was his holy day, and I admired that. When he would fly into Washington National, there'd be sitting Joe Lieberman's vice presidential candidacy plane sitting on the runway on Saturday because he wasn't going to campaign on Saturday. Gordon Smith, a Mormon from Oregon, one of the finest human beings I ever known, and he felt very strongly about his faith. Now, I think I'm Southern Baptist, but I was always raised, too, to also be respectful of other people's faith. That's part of religious faith, I think, is to have an open attitude. We know that in the world, and now it's used to abuse and, mistreat people, but it shouldn't be that way.
Todd.
I'm very encouraged by people of faith and people of all backgrounds wanting to serve together and, frankly, not having the same kinds of concerns that we older folk have had. I mean, we look back to the 2008 presidential election, and we saw, and after, people putting these kinds of judgments behind. And so I think we're very encouraged by that. After September 11th, 2001, in Philadelphia, we went and met with members of the largest mosque in the city. And if you remember back to that time, there was a great deal of violence and ridicule of Muslims, but also violence against people who weren't even Muslims, Sikhs, who people confused as Muslims. And we created a partnership between the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Perlman Jewish Day School, and we asked them to serve together on King Day. And these are young people who just really didn't have the same kinds of considerations that we older people do. So they came together. They worked at a food bank for 2 hours, served side by side. Maybe were a little nervous because they didn't know one another, but then came together in a little bit of fellowship and talked and found out that service can break down barriers, it can build relationships, and it can help us realize how much more we have in common. And as a result of that, these students from the mosque and from the Jewish Day School have served together 11 straight years. They have programs between the schools that go back and forth. And so I'm very optimistic that if we promote public service and service at the youngest of ages, it's a wonderful way of getting away from the kinds of considerations that we sometimes have, whether it's in religion or arguing about public policy.
Well, in our poll, we found enormous enthusiasm for the idea of a year of mandatory public service for 18 to 25-year-olds, except among 18 to 25-year-olds. Most Americans over 30 thought that was a great idea, but under 30, they thought it was not. Our pollsters, Mark Mellman and Whit Ayers, likened it to attitudes about public transit, that it was a good idea for somebody else to do. So, Chris, what do you think, the idea of a year of mandatory service? It could be in the military or the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps or Habitat for Humanity.
There's only a few things that U.S. citizens either have to or get to do. We have to pay taxes, we get to vote, we have to serve on juries. If you're male, you have to register for selective service. If you're female, you don't. But I don't know if that will change soon because of females in combat. But this idea that you volunteer in a way for service by signing up. We have that to a degree already. But we're not compelling people, we're not conscripting people into the military, we're not conscripting people into national service. Our entire military is all volunteer right now, which I think is very important, and for decades has been an all-volunteer force. So just like anyone who volunteers for America or who volunteers for the Peace Corps, who volunteers to run for office, everyone who served in the military, everyone in the military today, volunteered to serve. And I think that's important because many times military service inspires other types of service. As far as making it, compulsory and mandated by law, it's a difficult proposition. But maybe an easier proposition is to make it a cultural expectation, right? This idea that everybody has an opportunity to serve, and I want to interject that I was surprised at the poll that most people thought, about 2-to-1 ratio, that most people thought that opportunities to serve were ample. Because there's 500,000 people that didn't get into AmeriCorps last year that would disagree with that. 580,000 people applied, about 80,000 people, or 85,000 people served. And so if we had a cultural expectation that everybody spent a year or 2 years, some short term of service, in service, whether it was the military, AmeriCorps, or the Peace Corps, whether it was local opportunities that are certified as bona fide national service opportunities, we would create a country where everybody served, and where, as John often says, you could walk up to somebody in a cafe and say, so where did you serve? Where did you spend your year of service? And maybe not everybody has an answer, but most people would. And I think that would lead to a better cultural view of service, and that people want to be something bigger than themselves, and then that could elevate to even the way we feel about Congress, and understanding that just like you can serve here in Philadelphia, someone else chooses to do their service on Capitol Hill or elsewhere.
Well, John Bridgeland, I know you're running the Franklin Project, which is aimed at a similar idea, I think. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's named after this wacky inventor, Benjamin Franklin, who not only believed in constitutional government, but also, started the Leather Apron Society and the Street Sweepers Corps and the Volunteer Fire Department and the hospital. In fact, he did so much to promote big citizenship and interfaith dialogue that when he was taken to his grave, and he said, even if the Mufti from Constantinople wanted to speak in America, we should offer him a pulpit. There were people of the great world's faiths escorted him to his grave because he had this great vision of a ecumenical society and big citizenship. So our commander in Afghanistan, General Stanley McChrystal, comes back to America. And he said, for the first time in history, during war, less than 1% of Americans are serving in our nation's military. And he goes on to say that, leads to the complacent assumption that defending the country and serving the country is someone else's job. And he went on to call for large-scale civilian national service. And Susan, I love the way you framed it. What if we had a society where we said to every 18-year-old, as they make this, American rite of passage, you can serve in the Army, or you can serve in Habitat for Humanity. You can serve in the Navy, or you can join the Peace Corps. You can serve in the Marine Corps, or you can join your service effort with your faith-based institution. And so we're working with millennials all across the country, Dirk Kempthorne, Dan Glickman, Harris Wofford, Mark Gearan, this wonderful group of Americans, Condi Rice, Madeleine Albright, stepping forward together to envision a 21st century national service system. And one big idea is, in addition to growing AmeriCorps and Peace Corps and some of these federal efforts, in partnership with the private sector, creating a national service certification system. So any college and university, any nonprofit, any social enterprise could create full-time national service positions. Because Chris is right, 500,000 Americans are turned away every year, and 150,000 people want to serve in the Peace Corps for only 4,000 slots. That's sort of like a generation of talent and idealism being, needlessly lost.
Let's take a look at the results from our... Yes, please, Senator. Go ahead.
I promise to be brief. Where I'm from, if you tell me it's mandatory, I'm probably not going to do it. I believe in freedom and, encouragement to do things. But I must confess, I'm very attracted to what you said. And I would like for us to encourage more participation. I'd like that year of some sort of service. But there's one thing we've talked a lot about here today that we've ignored something else. The keynote speaker talked about it. one of the realities we have to deal with is, our government is in a lot of debt. We got a lot of fiscal problems. A lot of these ideas are fantastic, but the question needs to always be, okay, how are we going to pay for it? And I do think that's part of our civic responsibility, too, to not leave our children and our grandchildren with an overbearing debt that could destroy our country. So that's a little bit of a rain on the parade here. This is all well and good, but one of the reasons why we don't have a whole lot more of these positions in Peace Corps, there is a cost factor involved, and I think we have to keep that in mind.
Susan, I have to add one of the powerful components, and Trent, I agree with you 100%. The FEMA Corps, in an era of fiscal austerity, is mobilizing national service participants and saving the taxpayer $60 million a year. So all these agencies are looking at how could we take Franklin's notion of big citizenship, put people in a full year of national service, and reduce the cost of government.
By the way, I can't help but comment on this. I lost my home and my community to Katrina.
Yeah.
What I saw after Katrina, I will forever be appreciative of and indebted. The faith-based people, the illegals that came and helped us, let me guarantee it to you, it changed the attitude of people about illegal aliens immigrants, because we'd still be in debris down there. And they were volunteers, and they came from all over the country. They paid their expenses. It was Sikhs and Baptists and Muslims, everybody. And I've never seen anything quite like it in my life. And that is the American spirit. It's there more than we realize. It just takes some time, leadership, or an event to inspire it to come forward.
Since I am the president of the National Chamber Foundation, the United States Chamber of Commerce's effort, I think we need to herald just the sorts of things that we heard this morning just this afternoon from John Rohr, and that is what corporate America does to harness their employee corps. And these are outside of this mandatory year of public service for our 18-year-olds. It's a culture of contributing to your community, and corporate America has stepped up to the plate in amazing, amazing ways, from early childhood to the dropout issue, to the environment, to disaster relief, and on and on and on. And that's part of this culture. And what I worry about with this, we're going to channel, like Israel, our young people into something that we're missing something in the bathwater if we just do that.
Let's take a look at the results from our second audience poll question, which was about support for programs that pay for education costs in exchange for public service, like the Peace Corps in America. A popular idea among the people who are watching us online, 75% yes, 25% no. And we're going to pose our third and final audience question, which is this. Would you personally consider serving an elective or point of office at the local, federal, state, or federal level if given the opportunity? So if you're watching us, you can vote at our website, bipartisanpolicy.org/engageusa. Here's another question from our audience from Danya. This question is, how can we say we have great civic engagement if we have one of the lowest voter turnouts in the world? Eric, what do you think?
I'm beginning to think. I think the great challenge and the great opportunity is for us to constantly remind citizens that we have a responsibility to the preservation of this republic. And that responsibility is engagement. And we go back to education and the lack of civics that is being taught. How can you appreciate the power of your government to be transformative in the lives of its citizens if you don't understand how the government works? So I think an emphasis on the importance of civics education, a greater campaign to awaken people's appreciation for the role that government really plays in their lives and the difference they actually can make. I grew up in a very small rural community in Montgomery, Alabama, very poor. And there was a woman who took enormous dignity in the fact that she was a poll watcher. And if you asked her anything about herself, she would always work it in, well, I work at the pharmacy, but I'm also a poll watcher. She appreciated the role that she was playing in the community, and it was a very important role. And I think we have to encourage the imagination that whatever you do, Teach for America, through your church, through civic organizations in your town, through service in the military, that you're playing a very important role in helping to preserve this great republic.
Yes,
Susan, and I think to build on Eric's good points, that part of what Bridge and Ellen Casey are doing with the Franklin Project, if there was this expectation of service that Senator Wofford's been talking about for over a decade, an expectation of service. We've seen it, to Chris's point about military in Congress. We see it with returned Peace Corps volunteers. Their level of civic engagement and activism is significant. It will develop now with America, with Teach for America alums and others. Their level of civic engagement, I think, will be that much more substantive. So it is foundational, I believe, all of what we're talking about in terms of the service arena to greater and a heightened level of citizenship with voting, I would argue.
But let's face it, people are turned off. They're turned off by the process. I have people say to me all the time, well, it doesn't matter, they're all the same. You know, either one of them, they're, you know, it's the system. And my response to them is always that every election involves a choice, and perfect is not on the ballot. So one of those two people is going to be there. Which one? Perfect's not there. Which one is closer to your point of view, or which one do you think might, react? So I think we all have a duty as citizens to insist that our fellow citizens take that responsibility of voting seriously. And we also, those of us in public life, I think, have a responsibility of recognizing the effect that the nastiness, the vitriol, the dysfunction of our political system right now is turning off a lot of our fellow Americans, and I don't blame them.
Yes, Todd.
In 1994, I served as an international election observer in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was elected. And I watched people who had never voted before stand patiently in line for 6 and 8 and 10 hours, a very informed electorate who had never voted before. And then I came back, and I remember on primary election day in Philadelphia and throughout the Commonwealth that year, 25% of the people eligible to vote showed up. This past primary election, it was 9%. I mean, it is shameful in many ways. So I think it is, one, a combination of changing the culture, working on these great initiatives to encourage people to serve and to create more opportunities to serve. But I also think it involves kind of breaking down the barriers to voting. We have a very controversial voter ID law before the courts in Pennsylvania, and it's very partisan. But I would like to see opportunities for people to vote, which makes it easier. Online voting, where there are very few cases of fraud, not to be making it onerous for people to vote. So I think it's a process of harnessing all these different things.
Vicki.
I was going to say the same thing about breaking down barriers to voting, making it easier to vote. If we can do our banking online and do secure banking online, I think we can do secure voting online. And if you see where you've got more than just one day of voting, where you have increased voter participation when you've got extended voting in that way, make it easier for people to get to the polls, easier to exercise the franchise. I think you'll get increased participation.
How about voting on Saturday like they do in your home state of Louisiana? I always thought that was a great idea. Why do we vote on Tuesday?
That's true. That's true.
Make it Saturday. There's just one of many things we could do to make it easier for people. I'm from a shipbuilding community. My dad was a pipefitter worker in the shipyard, but it was very difficult for the shipyard workers to get to vote. And if it were on Saturday, it'd be a lot easier. It's one of many things we could do to make voting easier and more understandable.
Consolidating election days. School board elections are often on some random day, off cycle. Let's sync those up with primary or general elections. I mean, there's many things that we could do to encourage participation.
In our nationwide poll, we ask Americans how much they trust the federal government to do the right thing. Might seem like a loaded question. Now, we know that skepticism is a pretty fundamental American trait, and that's definitely what we found. Almost 2/3 said they trust the federal government to do the right thing only some of the time. And we didn't give the option of none of the time. But 13% of the people we surveyed volunteered none of the time. And Karen, you mentioned this attitude that it doesn't matter, they're all crooks, why bother? And I wonder if the panelists think that is one of the reasons we see people not wanting not only not wanting to vote, but not wanting to run or not wanting to work in a campaign. Does that have an effect? You're nodding your head, but who would like to speak?
Sure, kind of a loaded question here. I think, Gearan had discussed this earlier in our discussion upstairs about people they don't get the proper education, I think, in the schools about the problems of democracy and what we can do through government to solve them. I also think they they think of government bureaucrats or these politicians who never get anything done. And I think holding up examples of, we've saved 1 million lives over the last decade from malaria in Africa. And that was largely because the U.S. government went from a $35 million investment to a $1.2 billion investment and brought the world together around saving all these young mothers and children. Jim mentioned high school graduation rates. Graduation gaps are terrible. But the good news is, after 4 presidents set a national goal of 90% high school graduation rates by a date certain, for the first time last year, we were able to report that the nation is on pace and able to meet that graduation rate. So there are really hopeful things happening. People just don't typically know about them. And when I asked Cokie Roberts about this, she said, well, Bridge, newsflash, good news is not, news. It's got to be cynical and divisive and partisan. And so I think there's this effort called the Partnership for Public Service. Max Stier does this Service to America's medals every year, and they hold up people in government. And just, look at Exhibit A. Olympia Snow, Dirk Kempthorne, Dan Glickman, Harris Wofford. If you don't think voting matters and you don't think leadership matters, just look at what they were able to accomplish in Trent, Lott through government. And we've got to resurrect that notion for young people.
I'm one of the 64. I have faith in the government only some of the time. But I know that there are a lot of good people doing their best and trying to make it better, and they have to answer to their superiors. But also, I just have to always remind people, number one, we're still dealing with human beings who have, preferences, prejudices, abilities, lack of abilities. But also, I spent a number of years in the House and in the Senate as the whip. In the minority and in the majority. One of the things I used to do is analyze the demographics of every congressional district of the congressmen or the senators whose votes I was trying to influence. I studied Maine all the time so I could understand what Olympia was up to. And it was very obvious to me, people that are complaining about their congressman or their senator, they did put them there, and quite most of the time, they reflected the makeup of the demographics of the congressional district that they were from. That was true in my own case. I was born in a rural area. My dad is a shipyard worker. My mom was a school teacher, lived on the coast. I was involved in the fishing industry. And district after district after district, while there are exceptions, most of the time, what you get from government is what you put into government and who you elect. Chris.
I think apropos to Senator Lott's comments and to the poll, we actually, there's a disconnect, I think, the way that sometimes people think about their service here in their community and the service of those who represent them at the federal level. And at the lunch today, we had a lot of young people who are serving in some capacity, some of them national service, some of them local service. And Governor Granholm, she spoke, and she said to them that their service was not about them. It's about something bigger, right? It's not about you. It's about everybody. And they all vigorously shook their heads, yes. And I wondered, and I didn't ask, but I looked at them and I wondered, what if we asked them about service at a federal level? What if we asked them about service in Congress? Is that not about you? And I think many of them have the perception that those people who run for office, people who take these federal positions, it is many times about themselves. And I think that it's a large question. There's lots of factors involved. I don't know if the perception is necessarily right, but it involves the electoral process. It involves campaign finance. It involves the way that processes occur in Capitol Hill. And I might just table I just want to bring it up, but I want to table it maybe for Ohio, because that's the next stop of this tour is to talk about electoral reform. And I think it might be an interesting concept to bridge the public service perception at a ground level, the public service, and then the way people look up at service in Congress or at the federal level. It was interesting and enlightening with these young people who are dedicated to service.
Let's look at the results of our third and final poll question to our audience. We asked, would you personally consider serving an elective or appointive office at the local, state, or federal level if given the opportunity? And here's what you told us. Well, this is at odds with the actual experience in America today, but by 3 to 1, the people we survey would be willing to personally consider serving. That's not what we found, I've got to say, in our nationwide poll, but that's encouraging about our engaged audience today. Here's a couple more comments we've gotten today on Twitter. One from the Big James G is, public service means stepping up on your own and not needing or waiting for the government to do it. From Cindy B, I believe that public service should be requisite for most persons receiving public assistance. Is that feasible? And here's one from Doobie Doobie Doo, perhaps not his given name. How is it so many public servants get rich from public service? And here's a tweet we got from someone, Ted Burnett. He asked, has Washington become a modern-day Politburo, out-of-touch elitist who can no longer serve the people? A Politburo. What does our panel think? Anyone say yes?
Take the microphone. What's the question?
The question is, has Washington become a modern-day Politburo, out-of-touch elitist who can no longer serve the people? I mean, it kind of goes to Chris's point about the perception that federal officials, members of Congress, and others in Washington are really disconnected from the lives of Americans.
I'm going to quote a great political leader, and that is Trent Lott, who just said 5 seconds ago that you get the government that you deserve. And I want to echo something that I know an experience Eric had when he did presidential personnel, and it's this. Whether you want Hank Paulson to serve as the Secretary of the Treasury or fill in the blank, wonderful person, people, when tapped on the shoulder, Americans will serve. And sometimes you have to go find them and you have to say, we need you. I can't tell you, if I had a nickel for every person that served President Bush that said, when the president asked you to serve, you serve. And I'm sure that's true on your side of the aisle, Vicki. And I think Americans have that innately in their DNA. And so we got to go find them too.
But I wonder.
I don't think they become a group of elitists. Have you looked at the House of Representatives lately? I mean, they're very reflective, and I don't mean that in a negative way. And most of them are not wealthy, most of them make a sacrifice. When you talk about the amount of travel, the going back and forth, the time away from the family, the time it takes to campaign, the fundraising. And what you're paid when you have to maintain some living arrangement in Washington and some living arrangement back home. Because if you don't, people say, well, see, he's gone off to Washington. He's not one of us anymore. So, it is a great honor to serve in the Congress. And I appreciate every moment that I was able to represent the people of my district and my state. But one of the reasons why I left when I retired in 2007 is because I'd gotten to the end of my line, partially because of Hurricane Katrina. I couldn't pay my bills. You may find that hard to believe, but you need to take a look at what it costs to serve. And one of the things I didn't like and caused me to want to leave, I got tired of raising money around the clock. Because Senate races went from costing you $2 million if you ran statewide to $40 million in a state like South Dakota. The fundraising chase is a real problem. Now, you might say, okay, big boy, what's your solution? I hadn't figured that out yet. I don't want the government to pay for it. I don't want the taxpayers to have to pay for it, at least unless they choose. So there is that other side. I don't think it's a Politburo. I don't think they're a bunch of elitists. I do. You know what the one word that describes what's not right about Washington now? Leadership. Men and women that are willing to say, we're going to get a result on the farm bill, on immigration reform, on the budget, on water resources, on infrastructure. We're going to get it done. It takes the leadership to say to the Committee of Jurisdiction, have tax reform ready November the 1st, because it's going to the floor of the Senate, it's going to the floor of the House. I'm not indicting anybody necessarily in particular, but that's what it takes. Now, if your leaders take that kind of position, they could lose their leadership position. But why are you there if you're not willing to take a little risk and try to do what is necessary for the country? So I think that's something we need to think about. I think right across the board, We need women and men that will say, we're going to deal with this. I mean, I'm from a state where I got 3 death threats because I tried to help pass immigration reform in 2007. Olympia remembers that, and probably Dirk Kempthorne too. But I felt like we needed it for our country, not just because of the illegal immigrants, but because our legal system is a disaster. If you've got a talent, ability, something you can offer, if you're a physicist from Sweden or a doctor from Canada, you almost can't get in America, even if you try to do it legally. So we need immigration reform so that the people that are here can live a life with dignity, and so we can control it in the future, and so that we can encourage people that want to come to this beacon of freedom can get here in a sensible way. So, that's what we need more of, people that will put the neck on the line. That's one reason, this is a little partisan, but I'm a fan of Marco Rubio. And I talked to Marco about his effort on immigration reform. I said, if you need to do this, if you do it, it's going to show courage and leadership. But know this, no matter what happens, pass or fail, you're going to get hammered from the left and the right. So be it. I think people are hungry for leaders that will say, this is right for the country, I'm going to do it. Follow me.
Eric.
Why should I follow that? When I left the White House working on political appointments, I had the good fortune of going to the State Department and working for Ambassador Hughes in public diplomacy, running Fulbright programs. And it was there that I discovered who really makes the government works. It's all the countless men and women who work as careerists and who work in the Foreign Service. And I think we also have to be reminded that there are thousands of men and women who accept the challenge to serve, who are not elected officials, who add enormous value. And that gave me great confidence in our government and great confidence in the citizens not giving up and really investing in this great American enterprise.
That's a great word. Those are great words to close with. We're at 3 o'clock. I want to thank our panelists for being with us today for this very impressive discussion. Please let me also thank the Bipartisan Policy Center, the co-chairs and members of the Commission on Political Reform, the National Constitution Center, which provided this wonderful venue for us, our audience here in Philadelphia and online. Thank you all. We hope to see you this fall for our next town hall at Ohio State University on October 15th. Now we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with a great panel of former governors next. Stay with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back after our break. It's been a very exciting morning. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I'm Diane Tom, formerly of the National Association of Women Business Owners, and I'm also delighted to say that I'm originally from Philadelphia, so this is exciting for me to be back home. Yes. Well, as we continue this discussion on public service here at the National Constitution Center, our conversation on American unity, this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the governor's perspective. And as you can see, I'm joined by 3 distinguished former governors from states across the country. And let me introduce each and every one of them. You should have more information of them in your bio, on their bios in your materials as well. To my far left is Governor Dirk Kempthorne from the state of Idaho and one of the co-chairs of the Commission on Political Reform. And to his right is Governor Jennifer Granholm from the state of Michigan and a fellow member of the Commission on Political Reform. And Governor Ed Rendell from the state of Pennsylvania, who needs no introduction to this hometown. Well, as we get started here, we want to invite everyone at the National Constitution Center on our webcast to join this conversation. If you're physically here, as you know, you can fill out one of the cards that should be left around the seats. I know many of them have fallen off, but they should be there. Or if you're joining us by webcast, send us an email or a tweet. Our Twitter handle is @BPC_bipartisan. and use the hashtag #EngageUSA. I'll ask some of your questions and read some of your comments at the conclusion of our conversation. But first, I'd like to start with Governor Rendell, and as we focus on the governor's perspective on public service in the states. Governor, why don't we start with you, if you want to maybe give us your perspective. As this morning, as you know, we were talking about the political discord at the federal level and different ways that we can address that. But love to hear from you, one, how you first got into public service and what you think is different that's happening at the state level.
Today, much the same problems exist in Sacramento, in Springfield, in Albany, in Harrisburg, as exist in Washington, D.C. If you look at what's happened in state capitals in the last 2 years, it's amazing the ideological battles that are being fought with no real interest in moving the state forward, dealing with the real problems of the state. Take the issue of abortion. Abortion is dominating a lot of state legislators and governors' offices right now. The abortion debate, while the economies continue to stagnate and states doing virtually nothing to prompt economies. We don't seem to be able to get anything done anywhere. I mean, take Pennsylvania for an example. We had 3 important initiatives. Whatever you think of the merits of the initiatives, there were major initiatives. Governor Corbett wanted to privatize the liquor stores. He wanted a significant transportation bill, breaking a ill-thought-out Grover Norquist no tax pledge. He was willing to put $2.5 billion of new taxes and fees into our transportation infrastructure, which desperately needs it. And then third, pension reform. And unless we have meaningful pension reform to build upon some of the things we did when I was governor, the state's going to be bankrupt. Those were 3 crucial initiatives, and we couldn't get votes on one of them. They never even got a vote on the floor before the summer recess. And that's true in Michigan, it's true in a lot of other places. So I think that the gridlock based on ideology is strangling Washington, no doubt, we all know that, but it's also having a dramatic effect on state capitals as well.
Wow, that's interesting based on what we were hearing this morning. And before we hear from our other 2 panelists, let's take a moment to hear what our online audience has to say. You can vote at bipartisanpolicy.org/EngageUSA. And the question is, does your state government function better than the federal government? Well, look what we have here. 80% says yes and 20% says no. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I would say, I think you're right, Ed, about the gridlock that's happening at the state level, except for in many states, unlike when you and I were governor, we had legislatures of opposite parties, or we had, you had to forge some kind of compromise. I don't know what it's in Pennsylvania. Are both chambers now Republican? Yeah. And so same thing in Michigan. And our Republican governor has been pushing for an expansion of Medicaid, and he cannot get that to be able to serve the poorest citizens under the Affordable Care Act, even though he's got veto-proof majorities of Republicans. He can't persuade them.
Transportation also, right?
Yeah, yes, and transportation as well. The bridge, anyway, he had to go to the citizens and get it on the ballot. But it was even amplified even more, I think, when there was opposite parties, and that's what the president is facing as well. And the question is, how can you get people in office who are willing to compromise? And that's what that's the reason why I'm sitting here with the Bipartisan Policy Commission, is that there are people who think that compromise is weakness and that compromise is somehow bad. But if you have people who will not compromise on anything, you will get nothing done. And so that's the frustration.
In Washington, this is a fairly recent phenomenon, although I'd like to hear what Dirk has to say on this.
For sure.
If you think of President Bush's major initiatives, leaving aside the war for a second, his 3 major initiatives were the tax cut. He got about 35% of the Democrats in Washington supported it. Medicare Part D, about 85% of Democrats supported Medicare Part D. And No Child Left Behind, who was the congressional sponsor of No Child Left Behind? Ted Kennedy, the epitome of a progressive Democrat working with a conservative Republican president. So how did it go wrong in such a short period of time?
Let me,
Governor,
if I may, I'll
thank you.
kind of wrap a couple thoughts into this. When I was a member of the United States Senate, here I came from the West, all right, a conservative Republican. I'd been mayor of Boise, and I decided that we ought to stop these unfunded federal mandates on cities and states. It had been tried for 20 previous years, but I had a really good ally. Here I was, this Republican senator, and I had this major inner city Democrat mayor who was my partner, Ed Rendell. All right? And we had John Glenn of Ohio. We had Rob Portman of Ohio. You had to be bipartisan, okay? And guess what? We got the job done, and Bill Clinton signed it into law, and it actually works, all right? Still on the books. Now, this point about does your state government work better than the federal? Without question. I'm one of those odd people that made a decision to voluntarily leave the United States Senate to go run for governor. I happen to believe in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, that those rights not specifically delegated to the federal government are retained by the states. Okay? And in states, we had a wonderful keynote speaker where one of his key points was the federal deficit. In the states, by law, you have to have a balanced budget. No ifs, ands, or buts. You have to be effective. Plus, at the state level, you know where your governor is, where your legislators are, and governors work together. Maybe in a minute, we could talk a little bit about Katrina and what governors didn't matter, Republican, Democrat. Mm-hmm. You're American, and you do it right.
And you're closer to where service is provided. So even though there is gridlock at the state level, I would say that states are by far where the action is. I mean, I think that most governors would feel like they can provide the service better than anyone else, including the federal government, and would like some flexibility in delivering services because we can make sure the laboratories of democracy work, and then perhaps our experiments can be taken to scale.
Although I will say, on the Affordable Health Care Act, governors have performed abysmally, in my judgment. One, so many of them refusing to take the Medicaid expansion, even though for the first 3 years it's 100% federal funding, and for the next 7 it's 93 to 97%. We normally pay about 50-50 with the federal government for Medicaid. And secondly, how many states now, if anybody knows this, jump in, but how many states have given over the exchanges to the federal government to run? If we do things better than the federal government, we should want to run those exchanges.
It's a bit of irony, isn't it?
There's no way in God's earth I would have ever given the Pennsylvania exchange over to the federal government, and I was working on it in 2010, and we passed the committee on to Governor Corbett. But what are governors doing? What are governors doing today? We're making ideological statements that are costing our states billions of dollars and hurting people.
Well, it's clearly there's lots of issues that states can work together on, as
Yes.
we've seen here. But there's some issues where there's some, questions, right, on healthcare and others where things are. But it appears that the governors tend to work together, right? That they know ultimately that they have
on many things. Although it is hard to be completely exempt from the huge acrimony that's happening that you see played out every day in Congress. I mean, there is. Some of that does bleed in. But on most things, governors want to deliver service to their people, and we want to be able to move Congress in a direction that enables us to do that. And I think we work together.
Let's, before we move forward, let's go back to our question, our poll question. Does your state government function better than the federal government? And let's see what our results are here. What a surprise, right? 75% say no. And 80% say no, so it's even higher.
It started out the other way. Right. In the course of this conversation, I think you guys have totally influenced
that
the disease is universal.
Part of it.
Remember, the question is better. It's not worse. It's better.
Right.
They're both failing. There's no question about that. They are both failing.
Right. Well, and while we're here, we also want to go talk about a question that was submitted on Twitter from Common Sense Action, a group bringing youth voices to the policymaking table. They ask, Governors Rendell and Granholm, what did you do to promote civic education in your states? Governor Granholm?
Well, we actually had in Michigan, before Race to the Top for education, we had only one state requirement in education, and it was a class in civics. I mean, that was it. That was the one state requirement. So we had to change everything so that everybody took effectively a college prep curriculum. So it was a little bit different for us. Do you know what you guys had before that?
We had very little, and we put into the curriculum before kids graduate, they have to pass a basic civics test. And the First Lady, my wife Midge, because she's a federal judge, she wasn't allowed to advocate for any legislation or raise any money for any projects, but she took on as her sole portfolio civics education, particularly in elementary schools. And she worked with Sandra Day O'Connor to start bringing into Pennsylvania the We Civics kids. Nothing is more important. There is no reason that we should exult when 64% of people vote in a presidential election, and that's 64% of the registration. It's actually a little less than 50% of all the eligible voters. Think about other democracies in the world, it's abysmal. And that starts from our kids not understanding their basic rights and responsibilities early on.
Well, let me, if I may add, in the 4th grade in Idaho, the course is on Idaho history and how the system works. One of the years that I was governor, children in Coquilala, Idaho discovered that we didn't have an official state fruit. So they decided it ought to be the huckleberry, that little purple fruit. It grows wild in the mountains. So anyway, it got through both legislatures. So I decided I would sign it in Coquilala, Idaho, up near the Canadian border. So I flew up there. When I walked into that elementary school auditorium of 600 kids, all wearing purple, they all stood up and sang the state song, Here We Have Idaho.
That's so
I mean, that's civic. Beautiful.
Right. It is beautiful.
So.
But that's because you empower kids.
Yep.
When I became mayor, I don't know if any of you remember, but we took the mayor's name off all of the Welcome to Philadelphia signs, and we had a contest, one for school kids and one for, there was a 4th grade class in Northeast Philadelphia that won, and they were as delighted as can be. Their parents were all there. I visited, and we unveiled the first official sign. If you empower kids and give them some sense of doing stuff, and that translates, don't you think, through college kids?
It does. But I have to laugh because here's the story. My oldest child is so civics-minded. She just got the state motto tattooed on her arm in Latin. Wow. Si queris peninsulum amoenum circumspice. I'm like, actually, it goes on both arms. I'm like, I appreciate the civics, but...
May I give a kudo to the governor of Philadelphia, because this magnificent facility, this National Constitution Center, one of the prime instigators, as you know, was Ed Rendell. We really owe him a debt of gratitude nationally for helping to make this a reality.
We lobbied Senator Kempthorne.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what else. You know, we have this banner back here, bipartisan, but it is to find partnership. There was another thing. When I was Secretary of the Interior, we had a program, and we were looking for partners. The Ben Franklin Museum was in desperate need of freshening, of a remake. And so I said, the federal government will do 1/3. Ed Rendell said, I'll do 1/3. And the Pew Foundation said, we'll do the other 1/3. And so many of you remember Mary Bomar, who was from here as superintendent. But anyway, we came here, and that's how this thing should work. That's how the country should work, is partnership. Whether Republican, Democrat, it does not mean that you surrender your principles. But it means that you also are pragmatic and you deliver the results which the people hired you to come about and achieve.
And those partnerships can do so much. We all talk about a really high-speed rail line from Boston to Washington, D.C. And we can do that. We did 2 major freight projects with Norfolk Southern and CSX. 6 states each on each project. 6 states kicked in, the federal government kicked in, and the railroads kicked in. We could build high-speed rail with private involvement, states putting up some money, and the feds putting up some money. I'm going to Japan in November to see the Japanese maglev debuted. Goes 310 miles an hour. If we had it on the East Coast, Philadelphia to New York would be 23 minutes.
Can you get federal support for that in Congress?
Well, I think you can if there's private money in it. Could you get it for Amtrak to do? I don't think so. But if if the states ponied up, and as Dirk said, if the states ponied up and there were private dollars, then you have a much better chance of convincing Republicans in Congress to put up money, right?
That's right.
Well, obviously, there are lots of wonderful examples of how states work together with each other. Can you maybe talk about ways that the states can sort of maybe take what you all do with each other and sort of apply that to the federal level? Is there a way we can sort of bring that back to Washington to change what's happening there?
I think that the National Governors Association is a great opportunity for states to lead up, if you will, if you consider Congress up, to be able to challenge... to be able to challenge Congress to, as we band together, to pass things that will allow us to serve citizens better. And the NGA is supposed to be doing that. But one of the ways that I think states would be enormously supportive is if Congress were to lob some competitions to the governors and allow them, like they did for Race to the Top, to choose to opt in or not. So if you see some of the biggest problems in the country being, lack of an energy policy or lack of a jobs policy, lob a few small competitions. I mean, Race to the Top was $4.5 billion, which, is only 0.1% of federal spending. If you had that level of competition to the states, the governors, we are totally competitive with one another. We would go to our state legislatures, we'd bust through the bureaucracy, permitting times, whatever it was. If the governors could ask Congress for that, Democrats and Republicans, I think that we could help to lead to having a bottom-up solution for many of the nation's problems.
I think that's a great idea. There was something called Next Generation Energy. It was under President Bush. It was a competition among basically coal states because it was seeking to find a way to sequester the carbon during the coal burning process, to capture it, and then sequester it either underground or find some way to dispose of it without putting it in the atmosphere. If we can do that technologically, then all of a sudden, the fact that we are the Saudi Arabia of coal, we could use all of our coal, and it would be an incredible boon to our economy, as well as, obviously, a huge improvement to the environment. There was a competition. I'm sure Senator Snow remembers. There was $4.5 billion set aside for the winning state. Illinois won, but then the Congress, the Bush administration withdrew the funding. And that, for $4.5 million, to try to go down the road to something that could really unlock so much for America, gosh, but Governor Granholm was right. The competition was...
Race to the Top, 48 states participated. 48 governors convinced 48 state legislatures to adopt this high standards curriculum. This would never have happened were it not for this ability to compete for a pot of money. You could build strategies from the bottom up like that.
So based on this discussion and what we were talking about earlier this morning, how would you suggest, and we'll start with you, Governor Kempthorne, getting folks involved in public service? Would they start at the state level? Because it sounds like there might be more opportunities there. What would you do, personally, if you were?
There's nothing more important than your neighborhood, your community, where you live, where your children go to school, the school boards that need to have good people that serve there, volunteers that simply help the school. Sometimes you just need to have someone who will go to the classroom and be there with the teacher during certain periods of time. I mean, that's how simple it can be to get involved. It can be, I guess I'd put it this way. If you wonder if you should get involved in a nation that is a democracy, think about that. If you don't, someone will, because that's how we are constructed as a nation. And if you don't like the rules, well, if you didn't try to do something about it, someone else will make the rules. I remember when I ran for the United States Senate, and I remember Thursday afternoons putting my suitcase in the back of an El Camino to start driving around the state. And inevitably, when I would be putting that suitcase in the back of that El Camino, I'd see my neighbors putting the soccer bags and the Little League bags with the bats and the balls in their trunks. I had been my kid's soccer coach. I wasn't going to get to do that now. I was going to instead drive around. I remember going to county fairs. I don't know about you,
Plenty of them.
Jennifer and Ed, but they're lonely because you're seeing beautiful families at the fair and you're standing there in the midway shaking hands and your family's back home. There is a sacrifice, but I think often the sacrifice is your family members that wish you were home. But somebody is going to serve. And in a democracy, it's the citizenry. So I think you have not only an opportunity, I really think it's a responsibility to shoulder part of that magnificent burden called democracy.
I just want to give a plug, as some of you heard on the previous panel, to the Franklin Project and the goal, the big, hairy, audacious goal of getting 1 million young people to serve in either AmeriCorps, the Peace Corps, City Year, et cetera. I've got my City Year watch on here because 2 of my 3 children have been through City Year, and it has been so transformative for them, but also for their younger brother who saw them do a year of service. So they're modeling the way for the kids down. And it's true with all these kids who participate, whether it's Teach for America, because it's all about leadership. I mean, so much of the training in those programs involves leadership. To me, if we're going to focus on anything as a country or as states, to get young people to have the opportunity of a year or 2 of service is exactly where we should put in terms of the bang for our buck.
May I just add, and then Ed, a month ago, I was invited to speak to 125 university student body presidents. What an amazing group. And I wondered, would this be Woodstock 2? You know? I walked into the most wonderful group of young people, young men and women, that had the most astute, wonderful questions. And I asked them, because I was then headed to the Aspen Institute with John Bridgeland and the others to talk about this. And I said, what message should I deliver to those that are thinking about doing this, General McChrystal, et cetera? And they said, please tell them, we have a hunger to serve our nation, and we'd like different opportunities that, in addition to the military, please provide us. Harris Wofford, who's done a magnificent job on all of this. But young America, there's nothing wrong with young America. You know, we just need to make sure that we don't raise expectations and don't perform. Let's make sure that we have that infrastructure so that when they receive the call to serve, we're ready for them to serve because they're ready.
Yeah, I'd echo what both Governor Granholm and Governor Kempthorne said. In my book, I wrote my book for a number of different reasons, but one of the reasons was I wanted to...
Say the name of the book so that
you if they haven't bought it yet, they're never going to buy it. But in my book, one of the reasons I wrote it was to try to inspire young people to get into public service. And public service doesn't mean necessarily being governor or mayor or senator. It can mean being a planning director for a small township. It can be an assistant secretary of the DEP for your state. It can be so many different things. And it's true, as Dirk says, that there are tremendous sacrifices. Sacrifices in so many ways. You're not fully appreciated. You do give up a lot. But as I said in the closing paragraph of my book, I said, I've been out of law school for 43 years. I've never made anything close to what our society would call real money. The sacrifices are significant, but every day I got up, I knew I was getting paid to try to make people's lives better. And most days we succeeded. Not all the times, not in everything we wanted to do. And that's an incredible feeling. It's an incredible way to live your life. Would I change anything about it? Would I do it over again? You bet that I would. And that's the message that people like the three of us and others have to keep conveying to our young people. It's very, very important. But in addition to public service, I want to say one other thing. We've got to convey to other folks, you've got to vote. You've got to vote. And you particularly got to vote in primaries. Everybody, Senator Snow and I were on a TV show yesterday we taped for Sunday on NBC, and we were decrying, or I was decrying the fact that we lost Mike Castle, a terrific congressman, a terrific governor of Delaware, who would have been in the Senate. Am I right, Dirk? Someone who would have reached across lines and tried to build that bipartisanship. And We lost him to a right-wing candidate who was a decent and an honorable woman who meant to do well, but she clearly wasn't qualified. Well, why did Mike Castle lose? Well, because 30% of the Republican voters turned out in that primary. And had the other 70% voted, he would have won in a landslide. So we can't keep complaining. If we want Washington to change, we have to send a message to Washington. We have to send a message loud and clear that if you don't cooperate, if you don't try to do things that are good for the country and not just for your politics, we don't want you around anymore. And until we do that, that's a form of public service too. And until we do that, nothing is going to change. There have to be consequences for bad actions. You know that when you raise your children, and it's the same thing with running a government.
So for those of you who don't know, the book is A Nation of Wusses, How America's Leaders Lost the Guts to Make Us Great. So,
thank you, I think.
Sure. Governor Kempthorne, I wanted to talk a little bit about the appointments process and recruiting folks to run for office. I mean, voting obviously is important, but your state is dominated by Republicans, Idaho. Does that mean your appointments and legislations always sail through?
No. When you have that many of one party, as opposed to being so close that you got to win this for the Gipper and hold them together, you can have friendly fire. However, I think that when you have civility at the state level, I mean, when you can sit down with a committee chairman, with the ranking member, good citizens, and that's the thing. When you have appointments there within your states, what people pretty much know one another, and when you're asking someone to serve, they know that that's an obligation, and they're ready to willingly make that obligation. And I think by and large, you have a legislature that says, good for them. Yes, we'll do the due diligence, make sure they're qualified, that this isn't just someone out in left field. But let's just make sure that we have the proper procedure. At the federal level, it's taking longer and longer to get somebody approved, to the point that some good people, really their life is put on hold. They may be an attorney that's been nominated for a U.S. attorney post or a judge post, and who's going to take them back home as an attorney? How can they sign up additional clients when they just may get the call to serve nationally? And so you have a lot of good people then ultimately, before there's ever a vote, withdraw their name. One of the things that I've suggested, because if you look at this, it's real simple. If your party has the White House, then you think you should move a president's nominations quickly. But when you don't have it, then you delay. What I've suggested is we ought to just say that we will move them quickly, but make it effective after this current administration is out of office, so that we don't affect anybody. Who knows who the next president? Who knows what party will have the White House?
You mean to put time limits on it, but prospectively?
A vote up or down, yeah.
Well, Governor Granholm and Rendell, your states are not dominated by one party and often flip control from one to the other. Is the nomination process as contentious in the state as a result of that?
It wasn't, even though when I was governor and had a Republican Senate, which was really where the confirmations would go through. Actually, we fought on a lot of stuff, but on the nomination process, there was a good deal of cooperation, I'm happy to say. It wasn't true on the budget, but it was on the nomination process.
And I had a Republican Senate for all 8 years that I was governor, and we had to do deals. They held us up, and they could have held us up forever. And the way we did it, if there were 6 judges to be nominated from various counties, I would say, okay, you give me in these 2 counties, you give me a judge name. As long as they're qualified and pass the Bar Association test, I'll appoint them. You vote to confirm these 4 Democrats. And maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but you've got to do it. I said in my book, when I was a young district attorney, there was a change in the law. The Mapp and Miranda decisions had come in full force, and I needed 25 new assistant DAs. My office was only about 125, so I had to go to city council to ask for the money. And the city council president was a man by the name of George Schwartz, who later went to federal prison. And after my testimony, he said, we're going to table this, make an appointment, and come see me. So I came to see him, and he said, we'll give you the 25 assistant DAs. We want to name 5. And my first reaction was, I was a young, idealistic guy, was to tell him to, go stick it up his rear. But then I thought, I can pick 20, and I'll have 20 qualified attorneys serving to protect people. If I don't take the deal, I'll have none. And maybe I'll get lucky on some of the 5, and they won't be terrible. So I did the deal, and 2 of the 5 weren't terrible. 3 of the 5, I had a way of sticking them into things that were not quite as crucial as other positions for attorney generals, and we made it work. So politics is, by very nature, it's defined as the art of the possible. And unless you understand that, you're going to go down in flames. You can be the smartest person in the world, you can have the greatest ideas in the world, but if you can't effectuate them, you're going to go down in flames. And, Senator Snowe and I talked about leadership. And sure, leadership has to come from legislative leaders, but it has to come first and foremost by the chief executive. Example I gave. Can you imagine what would happen if President Obama stood up and said, look, I know that the Affordable Health Care Act isn't perfect, and I know it needs modification and changes, and I'm inviting Republican leadership and chairmen of the various committees to come to Camp David over a long weekend, give me your ideas, and let's try to work together to modify and amend the Affordable Care Act to make it better. First of all, the nation would be the same reaction as you had. There would be silence all around the nation. And then, would the Republican leadership, Dirk, have any choice but to cooperate and try to make that work?
They'd have to go to Camp David.
They'd have to go to Camp David, and they'd have to try to make it work. And it comes from the executive. And again, President Obama's had a tough row to hoe when Mitch McConnell, 2 months into President Obama's first year in office, says their number 1 priority is to make him a one-term president. No, Senator, I saw your job description, and your number 1 priority is to do things to benefit the American people. But still, got to reach out, and it comes from the executive. And I think we all did a pretty good job when we were governors and reaching out to the other side.
Yeah, I mean, that is true, but I would just add that you can reach out and reach out and reach out, and at some point somebody's got to grab your hand.
Absolutely.
And if they don't grab your hand, then you are, all you're doing is this. So it does take 2 to tango. The other side, both sides, have got to move. And if one side is the only one moving and the other one is rigidly standing there, that's a problem.
I agree with that.
Let me give you a little flicker of hope, though. There in Washington, D.C., when you look at whether or not it happens, tax reform, and I think we all have a problem with the current tax code and the IRS, but when you look at how Dave Camp, chairman of House Ways and Means, is working with Max Baucus, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, a Republican and a Democrat, they're working well. The House Ways and Means Committee have had 11 working groups, bipartisan. These are good folks. So we need to also...
Talk about the House.
No, that was the House.
Oh.
House Ways and
Camp
Means.
is in the Senate.
Oh, you're talking about Camp.
Camp
Yes.
is in the House.
Camp's in the House, you're right.
Yeah, I mean,
But
both are trying to do
can we
this.
get that same kind of spirit from immigration? You've got great immigration bipartisan support in the Senate. Now it goes over the House.
Well, all I'm saying is when you do see something good, you ought to acknowledge it.
True.
Before you jump to the next one
Totally
that's
agree.
not working.
Totally agree.
And actually, to follow up on that, Senator Hatch and Senator Baucus have adopted essentially the same thing as Simpson Bowles recommended, zero-based on all tax expenditures. $1.3 billion a year come out of the Treasury with these tax loopholes and what they call tax expenditures. So they're saying all of them are gone. You have to affirmatively come back and justify them if you want them put back into the tax code. Well, boy, that's exactly the way to do it. And when you ferret through that 1.3, if you cut out $200 billion, what would that be? Less than a sixth. That's $2 trillion over 10 years. Bingo.
See, I've thought if you had a tough issue, if you asked Haley Barbour, the former national chairman of the Republican Party, and Ed Rendell, the former chairman of the National Democrat Party, put those two people together, they will find a solution. They will find a solution, okay? That's what this bipartisan policy thing's about. You do not abandon your principles, but you do find solutions and results. Because absent that, why are you taking the space?
And do we think that's because they were governors or not necessarily?
No, because we're also, Governor Kempthorne was talking about our immigration task force, the BPC's immigration task force. Also has Condi Rice and Henry Cisneros were the 4 co-chairs. And take immigration as an issue. I would love to see, from my perspective, a comprehensive immigration bill that has increased border security, e-verification, but also obviously an eventual path to citizenship. I think the Senate bill's pretty good. But let's assume we're not going to get the Senate bill, then let's get something. There's so many pieces. If we break that down piece by piece, it's amazing how you'd get some unanimity on pieces of the bill. You would make some progress, and we've got to get some things done. When I was governor, I had the Republican legislature, and yet every single thing I talked about in the 2002 campaign, I made progress on. Maybe not 100% of the progress that I talked about in 2002, because I had to make compromises to get it done, but in every single element, we made significant progress in my 8 years because we compromised and moved the ball ahead. We didn't make a touchdown on every play, but we moved the ball ahead significantly. And I think that's what we got to start doing. And I think you will find, Jennifer, even in the House, I think you will find allies for that. The worst thing in the world, the 2 worst things in the world are the filibuster rule in the Senate and the Hassard rule in the House. If you put the Senate immigration bill as is to a vote in the House, no committees, no anything, just an up and down vote in the House, it would pass, right? Mm-hmm. There would be 70 or so Republicans and most Democrats who would raise their hands and vote yes. But what's stopping it? This unwritten Hassard rule. Filibuster? Find me anywhere in the Constitution that says, in one case, in President Obama's first 2 years, 40 senators representing 17% of the American people could stop anything from becoming law. You tell me where the Constitution allows that to be. So those are the type of things we've got to get over. The Hassard rule is purely a caucus rule, right?
I don't know. It's in the House.
Yeah. Well, we're wrapping up our time here, but before we go, Governor Granholm, you had eloquently said in 2010, there is a surefire antidote for the negativity and pain that besets our democracy. An antidote that is the purest act of all, service to others. How can this commission spread that message further?
Well, doing what we've been doing today, I think is important. I do want to say one additional word about recruiting women to run for office, because if I look back at my legislature and there were the tough things that had to happen, there were 2 women, a Republican and a Democrat, House and Senate, who I gave the stuff to, and they would do the hard work of amassing the stakeholders and crafting the compromises. If we don't have people at the table who represent all of us, if the leadership doesn't look like America, we're not going to be heard. And for women, women often have to be invited to run. And often when you ask women, why aren't you running? They will say, well, I am happy to be behind the scenes and do the work, but I don't want to put myself out there. I don't want to be the person. When I was young, my mom used to say to me 3 things. She used to say, don't talk about yourself, because people don't want to hear it. If a stranger asks you for money, or don't ever ask strangers for money, I should say. And if you're in a competition with a boy, let the boy win. Now, how I ever got elected with those 3 pieces of advice, I will never know. But there is a socialization that women still face often. And I'm so grateful for Title IX and for competition among young women who feel like they can get out there. But truly, women, as Marvin said on the previous panel, women have to realize that it isn't about them. If they care deeply about the future of this country for their children, or for their sisters, or for their sons, they have got to serve. It's a form of service in the same way that serving your military is. Your country needs you to raise your hand. So I want to make a strong pitch for you young people out here, for you old people out here, but particularly women out here, to consider serving your nation in that way, because we really need you.
And if I may, a couple footnotes. First, you need not look any further than this room to see two outstanding role models of what Jennifer just spoke about. Olympia Snowe, who I had the great honor of serving with in the Senate, and Jennifer Granholm, who I had the honor of serving with as a governor. So here's my footnote. There's two birthdays that I want to acknowledge. One is Shane Tom, who on Sunday turns 13, right? This is the wonderful son of our wonderful moderator.
All right.
And he's going to go to the Nationals game. He's a good baseball player, and they think he's a Bryce Harper. That's cool. The other birthday, which I'm going to run back to the Capitol to join in the celebration, is Bob Dole, a former Republican nominee for president. But I will tell you, just a few years ago, when I was at the National Amphitheater in Arlington Cemetery, that seats 2,000 people, and there were 2,000 people seated that day on that Memorial Day, Bob Dole came in unannounced and quietly just kept moving over to his seat, and one by one, people began to see it was Bob Dole, and Americans began to applaud, and a standing ovation of 2,000 Americans in acknowledging a true hero. See, that's where we want to always be as the United States of America, that we still have heroes and we will still acknowledge them, and that young people like Shane will know that they have a future because this country is the best in the world.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Governor
I just wanted to add, in Pennsylvanians, what Governor Granholm said is equally important. We are 47th out of 50 states in women in our legislature. It's an absolute disgrace. It's got to change, and both parties are looking for good women candidates. And I told them, right now we've got a bubbling cauldron among our teacher community. And I said to my Democrats, I said, go out and find a committed teacher who wants to change the way we deal with education in this state and run them. They would be great, and particularly women teachers. So if you know someone who's interested in running for office, get them to the right people, get them to the different parties, Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. Okay. Women deal with family issues so much better than men. They have so much inherent understanding of it that men lack.
Well, thank you, Governor Rendell, and for the other governors. Please join me in thanking them for being here with us today. And at this time, I'd like to welcome this Secretary Dan Glickman, who is co-chair of the Commission on Political Reform and a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the BPC, I want to thank all of you for coming, especially our commissioners and the wisdom of our governors who are here. Let's give a hand for all of our speakers. This is one of the best things done. I also want to thank our partners at USA Today, especially Susan Page, and our host, the National Constitution Center. I heard 10 big words today that I think maybe sum up everything we heard. They're in no particular order, but leadership, empowerment, respect, civics, duty, service, democracy, engagement, civility, and sacrifice. And I'm thinking of sacrifice, and I'm thinking of President Kennedy's words, ask what you can do for your country. And it really means what you can do for your society, what you can do for everybody here. And I'm looking at my friend Harris Wofford, who worked for President Kennedy and helped to create service in this country. And it really is an amazing thing that this great country of ours has the opportunity to change the world, and in the process change our own lives. And I think that's what we're talking about. 3 quick anecdotes. Dirk mentioned Bob Dole. Bob Dole told me years ago when I was perhaps talking too much, he says, Dan, you have 1 mouth and 2 ears for a simple reason. And I quickly got the message. The other, Ronald Reagan, said, I would rather get 80% of something than 20% of nothing. And that's the symptomatic. And then the words of Everett Dirksen, who was a great conservative. I don't know why I quote all 3 Republicans, but Dirksen said he once put a water project in a bill in Illinois, and his colleague Paul Douglas, who was a conservative, said, Everett, you're a conservative. You just put a $100 million water project in the state of Illinois. And he said, Everett, I thought you were a man of principle. And Everett says, I am a man of principle. And my first principle is flexibility. And so I think to some extent that's what we're talking about, is reasonable, sensible people making reasonable and sensible decisions, and in the process perhaps taking some courage as well. So we're going over all these recommendations. We're going to go ahead and go to Ohio State on October 15th to talk about political reform and campaign reform issues. And on March 26th at the JFK Library and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate in Boston, Massachusetts. And behind the scenes, we're going to be working on ideas, and we encourage you to give us feedback on Twitter, on Facebook, or on Instagram, as we try to do things that make this country more resilient, to make our political system more relevant, and to keep America strong in the process. This is the Constitution Center. And in 2004, Robert Byrd, the then Senate Majority Leader, put a little line in an appropriations bill. It says, every school and college that receives federal dollars must teach about the Constitution on September 17th, the day that it was adopted. I doubt very many people know that that's an unfunded federal mandate that must be talked about, just not every day, but the principles of the Constitution must be talked about every day. And 2 final quotes. One, I'll close with a quote from Margaret Mead, the American anthropologist, who said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. And finally, in the chair, behind the Speaker's chair at the House of Representatives in Washington, if any of you have ever been in the great chamber where the President gives the State of the Union message, there's a remarkable quotation from Daniel Webster, who said, let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, promote all its great interests, and see whether we also in our day and generation may not perform something worthy to be remembered. I used to look at that every single day I walked into the House. Perform something worthy to be remembered. I think if every elected official looked at that every single day, it might change his or her attitude about what the purpose is in governing, and it also might change the way citizens view the way government works. So I hope, first of all, I'm delighted you're here. On behalf of the BPC, we thank you, and we hope that you join with us, and together our group can bring glory back to the American democracy. Thank you all very much.